Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Lois Griffin is one of the most psychologically complex characters in Family Guy, and by examining her role as matriarch, her emotional regulation patterns, her moral contradictions, her parenting style, and her struggle. With identity, we can understand how she represents the tension between societal expectations and personal desires that many people face in their own lives. Through a psychological lens, we can observe patterns in her behavior that reveal deeper questions about responsibility, control, self-image, and resilience in the context of a chaotic, animated family. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Baseline identity, matriarch of the Griffin household. When a psychologist first encounters a patient or begins observing someone's behavioral patterns, they typically start by establishing a baseline. What is this person's default state? What roles do they occupy? How do they present themselves to the world? For Lois Griffin, the baseline identity is clear from the very first episode of Family Guy. She is the matriarch, the mother, the wife, the person who holds the Griffin household together when everything else threatens to fall apart. Understanding this baseline is essential because it shapes how we interpret everything else about her character and her psychological patterns throughout the series. Lois Griffin appears in the pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, which aired in January 1999. From the very beginning, the show establishes her as the stabilizing force in the Griffin family. Peter loses his job and hides this fact from Lois, creating a web of lies that eventually unravels. When Lois discovers what happened, she has to deal with the consequences of Peter's actions, while also managing the household and taking care of their 3 children. This dynamic, where Lois must respond to chaos created by others while maintaining some semblance of family function, becomes the defining pattern of her baseline identity throughout the entire series. A psychologist observing Lois would immediately note her primary role as caretaker. She feeds the children, makes sure they get to school, handles household management, and serves as the person who remembers appointments, birthdays, and responsibilities that other family members forget or ignore. This caretaker role is not just about practical tasks. It also involves emotional labor, which means managing other people's feelings, mediating conflicts, and providing comfort when family members are upset or struggling. Lois does this constantly throughout the series, often without recognition or appreciation from the people she cares for. The baseline also includes her identity as Peter's wife. Lois married Peter Griffin despite coming from a wealthy, privileged background. Her maiden name is Pewterschmidt, and her family represents old money, social status, and traditional upper-class values. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a wealthy businessman who never approved of Peter and who represents everything Peter is not. He is successful, refined, and concerned with status and appearances. Lois chose to reject this background by marrying Peter, a working-class man with no social standing, no wealth, and no prospects for upward mobility. This choice to marry Peter is psychologically significant. It represents rebellion against her family's expectations and values. A psychologist would note that Lois's decision to marry someone her family disapproved of suggests she was seeking something different from what her upbringing provided. Perhaps she valued authenticity over status, or emotional connection over material comfort, or freedom from expectation over security. Whatever her motivations, this choice shaped her entire adult life and created the context in which she now functions as a matriarch. The marriage also represents a rejection of her parents' world, a world that valued appearances and wealth over genuine human connection and authentic relationships. The tension between Lois's wealthy background and her current middle-class life appears regularly throughout the series. Episodes show her parents treating Peter with contempt, suggesting that Lois made a mistake by marrying beneath her social class. Her father, Carter, particularly expresses disdain for Peter and disappointment in Lois for throwing away the advantages her family could have provided. Yet Lois defends her choice and her husband, even when Peter behaves in ways that seem to prove her parents right. This defense of Peter, even in the face of his obvious flaws and failures, reveals something important about Lois's baseline psychology. She is committed to the identity she chose, even when that choice comes with significant costs. As a mother, Lois's baseline identity involves managing 3 very different children. Meg is the oldest, a teenage daughter who struggles with insecurity and social rejection. Chris is the middle child, a son who is not particularly bright and who often acts without thinking. Stewie is the baby, though he is actually a genius with advanced vocabulary and ambitions that far exceed what a baby should be capable capable of. Each child presents different challenges, and Lois must adapt her parenting approach to each one while also dealing with the constant chaos Peter creates. A psychologist would observe that Lois's baseline parenting style tends toward what is called authoritative in psychological literature. This means she sets boundaries and has expectations for her children's behavior, yet she also tries to be responsive to their emotional needs when circumstances allow. She is not purely authoritarian, which would mean rigid rules with no flexibility. She is also not purely permissive, which would mean no boundaries at all. Instead, she occupies a middle ground, though this balance is constantly disrupted by the extreme situations the family faces in each episode. The baseline also includes Lois's role as mediator and peacekeeper. In the Griffin household, conflicts arise constantly. Peter does something irresponsible or offensive, Meg complains about being mistreated, Chris gets into trouble at school, Stewie attempts some scheme for world domination or revenge against someone who wronged him. Into this chaos, Lois steps as the person who tries to restore order, to calm everyone down, to find solutions that allow the family to continue functioning. This mediator role requires emotional intelligence, patience, and the ability to understand different perspectives simultaneously. A psychologist would note that this constant role as mediator and stabilizer comes with psychological costs. When you are always the person responsible for maintaining equilibrium, you never get to fully express your own emotions or needs. You must always be thinking about how your actions will affect others, how to prevent conflicts from escalating, how to repair damage after problems occur. This creates a particular kind of psychological burden that accumulates over time and that shapes personality in specific ways. The mediator role also means that Lois's own preferences and desires often get pushed aside in favor of maintaining family harmony. Her needs become secondary to everyone else's needs, which can lead to resentment and frustration that builds up beneath the surface. Lois's baseline identity also includes certain personal characteristics that appear consistently across episodes. She is intelligent, significantly more so than Peter, and possibly more than most other characters in the show. She has talents in music, particularly piano, which appears in several episodes where she plays for the family or teaches piano lessons. She was once a model before she married Peter, which indicates she had aspirations and possibilities that she chose to set aside when she committed to family life. These aspects of her identity exist in the background, occasionally surfacing, but often suppressed in favor of her primary roles as wife and mother. A psychologist establishing a baseline would also observe Lois's communication style. She tends to be direct and articulate when expressing her thoughts and feelings. She does not typically manipulate or use indirect methods to get what she wants from family members. When she is angry, she expresses anger clearly. When she is disappointed, she says so directly. This directness is a strength in many ways, though it sometimes creates conflict when family members react defensively to her honest feedback about their behavior. Her communication style suggests someone who values honesty and clarity, though she must also navigate a family where direct communication is not always effective in changing behavior. The baseline also includes patterns of how Lois responds to stress in her default state. When problems arise, she focuses on finding practical solutions rather than on emotional processing. She organizes, she plans, she takes action. This approach works effectively for many of the immediate crises the family faces, though a psychologist might note that it leaves little room for processing the emotional impact of constantly managing chaos. This problem-focused coping works well for short-term crises, yet can lead to emotional buildup over time when the underlying stressors never truly resolve. Physical appearance is also part of the baseline identity, though this matters less in animated shows than in live-action content. Lois is depicted as conventionally attractive, with red hair, typically wearing casual clothing appropriate for a suburban housewife. Her appearance suggests someone who maintains herself, but who is not obsessed with appearance or status. She looks like someone who used to have more time for self-care, but who now prioritizes practical concerns over aesthetic ones. The show occasionally references her past as a model, reminding viewers that she once inhabited a very different world, where appearance and image mattered more. The baseline identity also includes Lois's relationship with the broader community in Quahog, Rhode Island. She has friendships, though these are less prominent than Peter's friendships with his bar buddies. She participates in community activities, attends PTA meetings, and engages with neighbors. She is embedded in the social fabric of her town. unlike Peter, who often acts as if social norms and community standards do not apply to him. This social embeddedness means Lois cares about reputation, about how the family is perceived, about maintaining certain standards of behavior in public, even if private family life is chaotic. She understands that the family exists within a community and that their actions have social consequences beyond just their internal dynamics. A psychologist would note that establishing this baseline is crucial for understanding everything else about Lois's character. The baseline represents her default state, the identity she returns to when extraordinary circumstances resolve, the foundation upon which all other patterns and behaviors are built. Without understanding that Lois's core identity centers on her roles as caretaker, stabilizer, and matriarch, it would be impossible to interpret her more extreme behaviors or her moments of deviation from expected patterns. The baseline also reveals expectations placed on Lois by herself and by others. She is expected to maintain the household, to compensate for Peter's failures, to raise the children, to be the responsible adult when no one else will. These expectations shape her psychology in profound ways. They create pressure, they limit her freedom, they define success and failure in her life. When she meets these expectations, she receives little recognition because this is simply what she is supposed to do. When she fails to meet them, she faces criticism and consequences that feel disproportionate given how little support she receives. Understanding Lois's baseline identity also helps us see what she gave up to occupy this role. She came from wealth, but chose a middle-class life. She had modeling career possibilities, but chose motherhood. She had talents and ambitions, but chose to focus on family. These choices were presumably made willingly, yet they created a life that is often frustrating, often thankless, and often limiting. A psychologist would be interested in how Lois processes these trade-offs, how she justifies her choices, and whether she experiences regret or satisfaction when reflecting on the path her life has taken. The fact that she sometimes engages in risky or rebellious behavior, as we will see in later sections, suggests that she has not fully resolved the tension between the life she chose and the life she might have had. The baseline establishes Lois as someone with significant responsibility but limited power. She is responsible for her family's well-being, yet she cannot control Peter's behavior, cannot prevent her children from making mistakes, cannot force anyone to appreciate her efforts. This combination of high responsibility and low control is psychologically significant because it creates a particular kind of stress that differs from situations where you have both responsibility and authority to make final decisions. This stress appears in many caregiving roles, particularly for parents, and particularly for women in traditional family structures where they are expected to maintain family harmony without having real authority over other family members' choices. The consistency of Lois's baseline across hundreds of episodes suggests that this identity is deeply rooted, rather than superficial or easily changed. While individual episodes might show her trying different roles or behaving in unusual ways, she always returns to this baseline of matriarch, caretaker, and stabilizer. A psychologist would recognize this consistency as indicating a core identity structure rather than a temporary role she is playing. This baseline identity has become who she is, not just what she does, which makes it both a source of meaning and a potential source of psychological strain when the demands become overwhelming. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. From this baseline understanding of Lois as matriarch and caretaker, we can begin exploring how she manages the intense emotional demands this role creates in a household defined by chaos and unpredictability. Section 2. Emotional regulation and conflict. One of the most psychologically revealing aspects of Lois Griffin's character is how she handles emotions in a family that generates extreme emotional chaos on a constant basis. A psychologist observing Lois would pay careful attention to her patterns of emotional regulation, which means how she manages her own emotional responses to situations, and how she attempts to manage the emotional climate of the household. Understanding these patterns provides insight into her coping mechanisms, her stress levels, her vulnerabilities, and the psychological costs of her role as family stabilizer. Emotional regulation is a fundamental psychological skill that everyone must develop to function in society. It involves recognizing your emotions, understanding what triggers them, and choosing how to express or suppress them depending on the situation. For most people, emotional regulation happens in relatively predictable environments where the same types of situations arise repeatedly and where you can develop consistent strategies for handling them. For Lois, emotional regulation must happen in an environment of constant unpredictability and extreme circumstances that would test anyone's emotional capacity. Consider a typical day in the Griffin household, as depicted across various episodes. Peter might decide to buy a tank, or quit his job to pursue a ridiculous dream, or accidentally destroy something valuable, or offend someone important, or create a public scandal that affects the entire family. Stewie might be plotting elaborate revenge schemes, conducting dangerous experiments, or engaging in behavior that would concern any normal parent if they fully understood what he was doing. Meg might come home crying about social rejection or asking for help with problems that reveal how much she struggles with self-esteem and social acceptance. Chris might have done something stupid at school or gotten into trouble that requires parental intervention. Each of these situations creates emotional demands on Lois that she must process and respond to. A psychologist would observe that Lois's primary emotional regulation strategy is compartmentalization, which means separating different emotional experiences into distinct mental categories so they do not overwhelm you all at once. When Peter does something ridiculous, Lois handles that situation and the emotions it creates. Then, when Meg needs attention, she shifts to handling that situation with its own emotional demands. She does not typically allow emotions from one situation to bleed into how she handles another situation. This compartmentalization allows her to function despite the constant barrage of emotional demands, though it also means she rarely gets to fully process any single emotional experience before the next one arrives demanding her attention. The episode "And the Wiener Is" from Season 3 provides a clear example of Lois's emotional regulation being tested. In this episode, the family goes to a spelling bee where Meg is competing. Peter, as usual, draws attention to himself and embarrasses the family through his behavior. Lois must manage her own embarrassment and frustration with Peter, while also supporting Meg and trying to maintain family cohesion in a public setting. She compartmentalizes her anger at Peter, setting it aside temporarily to focus on Meg's needs and on managing the immediate social situation, then addressing Peter's behavior later, when the immediate crisis has been resolved, and when expressing. Anger will not make the public situation worse. However, Lois's emotional regulation is not unlimited. The series regularly shows moments when her ability to manage emotions breaks down, when the stress becomes too much, and when she reacts in ways that reveal the pressure she has been suppressing. These moments of emotional breakdown are psychologically significant because they show what happens when coping mechanisms fail and when accumulated stress overwhelms a person's capacity to contain it through normal regulatory strategies. One of the most revealing examples is the episode "Breaking Out is Hard to Do" from Season 4, where Lois gets arrested for shoplifting. The episode reveals that Lois has been shoplifting for the thrill, engaging in risky behavior as a way to deal with the stress and monotony of her life. When she gets caught and goes to prison, her carefully maintained emotional control completely unravels. She has a breakdown in prison, crying and expressing how overwhelmed she feels by the demands of her life and how trapped she feels in her role. A psychologist would interpret this shoplifting behavior as a maladaptive coping mechanism. Maladaptive means it provides temporary emotional relief, but creates bigger problems long-term. The thrill of shoplifting gave Lois a rush of excitement and a sense of control in a life where she often feels powerless and stuck in routines. The risk involved provided a break from the emotional numbness that can come from constant compartmentalization and suppression of feelings. However, this coping mechanism was destructive and ultimately led to consequences that affected her entire family, demonstrating how unresolved emotional stress can lead to increasingly problematic behaviors. The episode "Stewie Kills Lois" and "Lois Kills Stewie" from Season 6, while actually a simulation that Stewie is running, reveals something important about Lois's emotional state. The premise involves Stewie succeeding in killing Lois, which allows the show to explore how the family would function without her, and also to show perspectives on Lois's role in the family. While this is fantasy within the show's reality, the fact that such episodes exist suggests the writers recognize that Lois experiences the family situation as potentially deadly, as something that might actually kill her through accumulated stress and demands if left unchecked. Lois's emotional regulation also involves managing other people's emotions, not just her own. This is called co-regulation in psychology, where one person helps regulate another person's emotional state. Parents do this with children constantly, helping calm them when upset, helping them identify and name emotions, helping them develop strategies for managing feelings. Lois does this with her children regularly, though she must also do it with Peter, essentially treating him as another child who needs emotional guidance and regulation, rather than as an equal adult partner in managing the household. The episode 15 Minutes of Shame from Season 2 shows Lois trying to regulate the family's behavior when they are selected for a reality TV show. She recognizes that the family's normal chaos will be embarrassing on television, so she tries to get everyone to act more appropriately. This requires managing not just behavior, but the emotions driving that behavior. She tries to help Peter understand why his actions create problems, tries to help the kids present themselves well, tries to create an emotional climate where appropriate behavior is possible. Her attempts fail spectacularly, as they often do, which adds to her frustration and stress levels. A psychologist would note that Lois's anger, when it surfaces, tends to be explosive rather than gradual. This pattern suggests that she suppresses anger for extended periods, rather than expressing it in small amounts as situations arise. The suppression allows her to maintain peace and to avoid constant conflict, yet it means anger accumulates until it eventually erupts. These eruptions are dramatic and can be quite intense, revealing just how much emotion she has been holding back during periods when she appeared calm and in control. The pattern of suppression followed by eruption is psychologically significant. It indicates that Lois prioritizes relationship harmony and family stability over her own emotional expression. She believes, consciously or unconsciously, that expressing anger or frustration in the moment would create more problems than it solves. So she contains those feelings, manages them internally, and only releases them when containment becomes impossible. This is a common pattern in people who occupy caretaker roles, particularly women in traditional family structures where emotional expression is often discouraged or seen as disruptive to family harmony. Lois also experiences what psychologists call emotional labor, which means work that involves managing emotions as part of your role. Traditionally, this term applied to jobs like customer service, where employees must present pleasant emotions regardless of how they actually feel. In families, emotional labor involves remembering emotional details about family members, anticipating emotional needs, creating positive emotional experiences, managing conflicts before they escalate, and maintaining emotional connections. Lois performs this emotional labor constantly, often invisibly, as part of her role as matriarch, and this labor is rarely recognized or compensated. The episode Let's Go to the Hop from Season 2 shows Lois managing a crisis where Chris gets involved with drugs at school. Specifically, toad licking, which was a trend at the school. Lois must regulate her own fear and worry about her son's safety, while also staying calm enough to help Chris, while also managing Peter's completely inappropriate response to the situation, where he goes undercover as a cool kid. She compartmentalizes her emotions, focuses on problem solving, and only later allows herself to experience the full weight of worry and fear about her son's safety and well-being. This delayed emotional processing is characteristic of her regulation pattern throughout the series. Lois's emotional regulation also involves what psychologists call affect management, which means controlling the intensity and expression of feelings. When situations arise that would make most people scream or cry immediately, Lois often maintains composure, at least initially. She does not allow herself the luxury of immediate emotional release because she is needed to handle the situation. Only after addressing immediate practical concerns does she sometimes allow herself emotional expression, and even then it is often partial or controlled rather than complete release. The series also shows moments where Lois's emotional regulation takes the form of resignation or acceptance rather than active suppression. In some episodes, she seems to give up fighting against the family's chaos, and instead just accepts that this is her reality. This acceptance is itself a form of emotional regulation, reducing internal conflict by aligning expectations with reality rather than continuing to wish things were different. However, this resignation can also indicate emotional exhaustion or even depression, where the person no longer has energy to maintain hope that things will improve or to continue fighting for change. Lois's emotional responses to her children reveal different regulation patterns for different relationships. With Meg, Lois sometimes shows impatience or dismissiveness, possibly because Meg's problems feel less urgent than Peter's crises or Stewie's dangerous behavior, or possibly because Lois has limited emotional capacity and must prioritize. With Chris, she shows more patience and nurturing, perhaps because his needs are simpler and less emotionally demanding, or perhaps because he does not challenge her in the ways that Meg sometimes does. With Stewie, she often seems confused or uncertain, not fully understanding him, but trying her best to meet his needs as she understands them. These differential patterns suggest that Lois's emotional capacity is limited, and that she allocates it based on perceived urgency and her ability to actually help. A psychologist would also note physical manifestations of emotional stress that appear occasionally in the show. Lois sometimes appears exhausted, haggard, or visibly stressed. These physical signs indicate that emotional regulation is taking a physical toll, that the constant management of emotions and containment of stress is affecting her body as well as her mind. Chronic stress produces real physiological changes, including impacts on the immune system, cardiovascular system, and overall health. And while Family Guy does not usually deal with these realistically, the visual representation of stress on Lois suggests the writers understand this connection. The relationship between emotional regulation and Lois's sense of self is also important. When she successfully manages emotions and keeps the family functioning, she likely feels competent and valuable. When her regulation fails and things fall apart, she likely experiences shame, guilt, or feelings of inadequacy. Her self-esteem appears to be significantly tied to her success in this regulatory role, which means she is psychologically vulnerable to situations that overwhelm her capacity to cope and that reveal the limits of her control. Lois's emotional regulation patterns also involve social comparison and reference to external standards. She seems aware of how other families function, or at least how families are supposed to function, according to social norms and media representations. This awareness makes her feel embarrassed when the Griffin family fails to meet those standards, and makes her try harder to create the appearance of normalcy even when actual normalcy is impossible. The gap between what she thinks family life should be and what it actually is in her household creates emotional distress that she must constantly manage through various regulatory strategies. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of emotional regulation and the stress they create directly connect to how Lois approaches responsibility and control, attempting to maintain order in a household that constantly resists her efforts. Section 3. Responsibility, control, and family management. The relationship between responsibility and control is one of the most psychologically complex aspects of Lois Griffin's character. A psychologist observing her would notice immediately that she carries enormous responsibility for keeping the Griffin household functioning, yet she has very limited control over the factors that determine whether she succeeds or fails in that. Responsibility. This mismatch between responsibility and control creates a specific type of psychological stress that shapes how Lois behaves, how she makes decisions, and how she tries to manage her family. Responsibility without control is a well-studied phenomenon in psychology. When someone is held responsible for outcomes yet cannot control the factors that produce those outcomes, they experience a particular kind of stress that can lead to anxiety, frustration, and feelings of helplessness. Lois experiences this constantly. She is responsible for making sure that children are fed, clothed, and safe. She is responsible for maintaining the household. She is responsible for managing the family's finances. She is responsible for keeping Peter from destroying their lives through his impulsive decisions. Yet she cannot actually control whether Peter will listen to her advice, whether the children will follow her rules, or whether circumstances will cooperate with her plans. The episode Mind Over Murder from Season 1 provides a clear example of Lois trying to maintain control over household responsibilities. In this episode, Peter becomes completely obsessed with television and stops participating in family life. Lois must take on all household responsibilities herself, while also trying to manage Peter's behavior and get him back to normal functioning. She organizes, she plans, she tries different strategies to reach Peter. Yet, ultimately, she has limited control over whether Peter will change his behavior. Her responsibility for maintaining the household remains constant, regardless of whether Peter contributes or not. A psychologist would observe that Lois responds to this responsibility-control mismatch by attempting to increase her control wherever possible. She creates rules and expectations for family members. She establishes routines and structures. She tries to anticipate problems before they occur, and to prevent crises through advanced planning. These attempts to increase control are psychologically understandable. When you feel responsible yet powerless, increasing control over whatever you can control provides some sense of agency and competence. The episode A Fish Out of Water from Season 3 shows Lois trying to manage family responsibilities during a vacation. The family goes to a summer home, and Lois attempts to ensure that everyone follows basic rules about safety and appropriate behavior. She tries to control where the children swim, what activities they engage in, and how late they stay up. Her attempts at control stem from her sense of responsibility for their well-being. Yet the family constantly resists her control, doing what they want regardless of her rules or concerns. This pattern of Lois trying to exercise control and family members resisting that control appears throughout the series. However, attempts to increase control can backfire when they become too rigid or when they are applied in situations where control is simply not possible. A psychologist would note that Lois sometimes crosses the line from appropriate structure into over-control, attempting to manage aspects of family life that cannot or should not be managed so tightly. This over-control often leads to rebellion from family members who feel suffocated by her rules and expectations. The episode Don't Make Me Over from Season 4 shows this dynamic. Meg wants to change her appearance and image, and Lois initially tries to control this process, dictating what Meg should wear and how she should present herself. Lois's attempts at control come from a place of caring and from wanting to protect Meg from making bad decisions. Yet her over-control backfires, creating conflict with Meg and ultimately not preventing the problems Lois was worried about. This pattern reveals how Lois's sense of responsibility drives her toward control, yet control itself is often ineffective in achieving the outcomes she wants. Family management for Lois involves constantly juggling multiple responsibilities simultaneously. She must think about meal planning, school schedules, doctor appointments, household repairs, family finances, and countless other practical matters. A psychologist would recognize this mental load, which means the invisible cognitive labor of remembering, planning, and organizing that is necessary for household management. This mental load is exhausting, even when circumstances are stable. In the Griffin household, where crises arise constantly and where nothing ever goes according to plan, the mental load becomes overwhelming. The episode E Peterbus Unum from Season 2 demonstrates Lois managing family responsibilities during an extreme situation. Peter declares the Griffin house an independent nation to avoid following city rules. Lois must manage the practical realities of this situation, figuring out how to continue providing for the family's basic needs while Peter pursues his ridiculous vision of sovereignty. She takes responsibility for ensuring the children still get educated, that food continues to be available, that bills get paid. Her management skills keep the family functioning even when Peter's actions create chaos. A psychologist would also observe how Lois manages family dynamics and relationships as part of her responsibilities. She mediates conflicts between family members, she encourages positive interactions, she tries to create opportunities for family bonding. This relationship management is just as important as practical household management, yet it is even more difficult to control. You cannot force people to like each other or to get along. You can create conditions that make positive relationships more likely, yet ultimately, people choose how they interact with each other. The episode Lethal Weapons from Season 3 shows Lois trying to manage conflict after she learns martial arts. Peter becomes jealous of her new skills and their relationship becomes strained. Lois must manage this relationship conflict while also dealing with Peter's increasingly problematic behavior in the community. She tries to use communication, she tries to set boundaries, she tries to find compromises. These relationship management strategies require emotional intelligence and patience. They also require accepting that she cannot control Peter's feelings or reactions, only how she responds to them. Financial management is another area where Lois carries significant responsibility with limited control. The family lives on Peter's income from his job at the toy factory, which is not substantial. Lois must manage a limited budget, while Peter regularly makes financial decisions without consulting her. He buys expensive items they cannot afford, he quits his job impulsively, he gambles or wastes money on schemes. Each of these actions affects the family's financial stability, yet Lois has limited power to prevent them. The episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1 begins with Peter getting a large check due to an error and then losing the family's money through gambling. Lois discovers what happened and must deal with the financial consequences. She cannot reverse Peter's decisions, yet she remains responsible for ensuring the family has food, housing, and other necessities. This pattern of Peter creating financial crises and Lois managing the aftermath appears repeatedly throughout the series. A psychologist would recognize this as creating chronic financial stress for Lois. Stress that comes from knowing her family's security depends on factors she cannot control. Time management is another dimension of Lois's responsibilities. She must coordinate everyone's schedules, ensure people arrive where they need to be on time, and allocate her own time among competing demands. A psychologist would note that Lois's time is not really her own. It is constantly claimed by other family members' needs and by household responsibilities. This lack of control over her own time affects her ability to pursue personal interests, to rest adequately, or to maintain friendships outside the family. The episode The Story on Page 1 from Season 2 shows Lois managing time and schedules during Peter's attempt to become a journalist. She must maintain normal family routines while also dealing with the chaos Peter creates through his investigative reporting. She coordinates children's activities, manages meals, keeps the household running. All of this requires precise time management and the ability to adapt when unexpected situations arise, which they constantly do in the Griffin household. A psychologist would also observe how Lois manages her own expectations about control and responsibility. Early in the series, she seems to believe that if she just tries hard enough, plans carefully enough, and remains vigilant enough, she can prevent major problems and keep the family functioning well. Over time, her expectations appear to shift toward greater acceptance that some chaos is inevitable and that perfect control is impossible. This shift represents a psychological adaptation to reality, though it may also reflect resignation or reduced hope that things will improve. The episode I Take Thee Quagmire from Season 4 shows Lois managing the family during Peter's involvement in Quagmire's wedding. She tries to ensure the family presents themselves appropriately at the wedding, tries to manage Peter's behavior, tries to prevent embarrassment. Yet despite her efforts, chaos ensues, as it always does. A psychologist would notice how Lois responds to these repeated failures of control. Does she blame herself? Does she lower her expectations? Does she continue trying with the same strategies even though they rarely work? These responses reveal her psychology and her coping mechanisms. The physical and mental exhaustion that comes from constant responsibility and limited control also appears in how Lois is portrayed. Episodes occasionally show her looking tired, overwhelmed, or at her breaking point. A psychologist would recognize these as signs that her coping resources are depleted, and that the chronic stress of her role is taking a toll. The fact that she continues functioning despite this exhaustion speaks to her resilience, yet it also raises questions about sustainability and about what might happen if her exhaustion reaches a critical level. Lois's approach to family management also reveals her values and priorities. She prioritizes stability over change, predictability over spontaneity, responsibility over fun. These priorities make sense given her role as the family's stabilizer. Yet they also create friction with family members who have different priorities, particularly Peter, who values fun and spontaneity over responsibility and stability. A psychologist would note how these value differences create ongoing tension in the marriage and in the household. The episode Road to Rhode Island from Season 2 shows Lois managing the household while Peter and Brian are away. She must handle all responsibilities alone, demonstrating that she is the essential person holding everything together. When problems arise with the children or with the house, she has no backup and no one to share the burden with. This solo management reveals how much she typically carries even when Peter is present, since he rarely provides meaningful support with household responsibilities or family management. A psychologist would also consider how Lois's gender affects her experience of responsibility and control. Women in traditional family structures often carry disproportionate responsibility for household management and childcare while having limited authority to make major family decisions. Lois embodies this pattern. She manages the daily details that keep the family functioning, yet Peter often makes major decisions without consulting her or considering how those decisions affect the practical realities she must manage. The episode Patriot Games from Season 4 demonstrates this dynamic. Peter decides to join the New England Patriots football team without discussing this with Lois or considering how it affects family life. Lois must adapt to this new reality, managing the household around Peter's schedule and dealing with the consequences of his fame. She had no say in the decision, yet she bears responsibility for making it work. This pattern of Peter making decisions and Lois managing consequences appears throughout the series. Managing children's behavior and development is another area where Lois carries significant responsibility with limited control. She can provide structure, guidance, and support, yet ultimately, each child makes their own choices and develops their own personality. Meg's social struggles, Chris's academic difficulties, and Stewie's mysterious genius infant behavior are all things Lois tries to address, yet they are not things she can simply fix through good parenting. A psychologist would recognize that Lois experiences the common parental anxiety of feeling responsible for how your children turn out, while knowing you cannot control every factor that shapes them. The episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart from Season 3 shows Lois trying to manage family relationships after she and Peter have a fight. She must help the children cope with parental conflict while also managing her own feelings and trying to repair her marriage. This multi-level management, where she must handle her own emotions, support her children emotionally, and work on relationship repair, demonstrates the complexity of her family management responsibilities. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of responsibility, control, and management set the stage for understanding the contradictions in Lois's behavior, particularly the moments when she acts in ways that seem to contradict her responsible, controlled persona. Section 4. Moral ambiguity and behavior contradictions. One of the most psychologically interesting aspects of Lois Griffin's character is that her behavior does not consistently align with the values and moral standards she claims to hold. A psychologist observing Lois would note significant contradictions between her stated beliefs about right and wrong and her actual behavior in various situations. These contradictions reveal internal conflicts, unmet needs, and the psychological strain of trying to maintain a particular identity while feeling trapped or unfulfilled in important ways. Lois presents herself as the moral center of the Griffin family. She criticizes Peter for his irresponsible behavior. She tries to teach the children right from wrong. She expresses disapproval when family members behave inappropriately. She positions herself as someone who values responsibility, honesty, and conventional morality. Yet episodes throughout the series show Lois engaging in behavior that contradicts these stated values, revealing that her internal psychology is more complex than her public persona suggests. The clearest example of this contradiction appears in the episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do from Season 4. This episode reveals that Lois has been shoplifting regularly, stealing items from stores for the thrill of it. This behavior directly contradicts her identity as a responsible, law-abiding person who teaches her children to follow rules and respect property. A psychologist would be very interested in this contradiction. What need was Lois meeting through shoplifting? What does this behavior reveal about her internal state? The shoplifting behavior suggests several things psychologically. First, it indicates that Lois experiences her normal life as lacking excitement or stimulation. The thrill of stealing provides an adrenaline rush that her daily routine does not offer. Second, it suggests feelings of powerlessness or deprivation in her everyday life. Taking things without paying might represent reclaiming power or getting something for herself in a life where she constantly gives to others. Third, it reveals risk-taking tendencies that are normally suppressed but that find expression in this destructive way. When Lois gets arrested for shoplifting in that same episode, she has an emotional breakdown in prison. She cries and expresses feeling overwhelmed by the demands of her life, feeling trapped and exhausted. This breakdown connects the shoplifting behavior to her psychological state. The shoplifting was not just about wanting material goods. It was a maladaptive coping mechanism for dealing with stress, frustration, and feelings of being trapped in a life that felt limiting and overwhelming. A psychologist would recognize this pattern where people under chronic stress sometimes engage in self-destructive behaviors that provide temporary relief, yet ultimately make things worse. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment from Season 8, though controversial and banned in the United States, shows another form of moral complexity in Lois's character. In this episode, Lois agrees to be a surrogate for a friend, becoming pregnant with another couple's child. When the friend dies, Lois must decide whether to terminate the pregnancy or carry it to term. The episode explores complex moral questions about abortion, bodily autonomy, and competing values. Lois's willingness to engage with this situation at all reveals that she is not simply a conventional person who always follows expected rules. She considers options and makes decisions based on circumstances rather than rigid moral principles. Gambling is another area where Lois has shown problematic behavior that contradicts her responsible persona. Several episodes reference or show Lois gambling, sometimes to problematic degrees. The episode Patriot Games from Season 4 includes references to Lois betting on sporting events. While this is played for comedy, a psychologist would note that the same person who criticizes Peter for wasting money and making irresponsible choices also engages in risky financial behavior herself. This contradiction suggests internal conflicts between the role she feels obligated to play and behaviors that provide escape or excitement. The episode Jungle Love from Season 4 shows Lois making morally questionable decisions when Peter runs away to live in the jungle. Lois tracks him down and tries to bring him home, yet her methods include manipulation and deception. She is willing to use morally gray tactics to achieve what she considers a morally good outcome, which is getting Peter back with his family. A psychologist would note this utilitarian approach to morality, where the ends justify the means, contrasts with the rule-based morality Lois usually claims to follow. Lois's relationship with alcohol also reveals contradictions. She criticizes Peter's drinking regularly, positioning herself as the sober, responsible adult. Yet episodes show Lois drinking to cope with stress, occasionally drinking to excess, and using alcohol as an escape from her problems. The episode The Thin White Line from Season 3 shows the family dealing with substance abuse issues, and while the focus is on Brian's cocaine use, Lois's own relationship with alcohol as a coping mechanism is present in the background. A psychologist would interpret these contradictions through the concept of cognitive dissonance, which means the psychological discomfort that comes from holding conflicting beliefs or from behaving in ways that contradict your stated values. When people experience cognitive dissonance, they typically try to reduce it, either by changing their behavior to match their values, by changing their values to justify their behavior, or by creating rationalizations that allow them to maintain both the behavior and the values simultaneously. Lois appears to use rationalization to manage her cognitive dissonance. She likely tells herself that her shoplifting, gambling, or other questionable behaviors are exceptional rather than representative of who she really is. She might rationalize that she deserves these small outlets given how much she sacrifices for her family. She might minimize the seriousness of these behaviors, telling herself they are harmless when they actually create real problems. These rationalizations allow her to continue seeing herself as a good moral person, even when her behavior contradicts that self-image. The episode Running Mates from Season 2 shows Lois behaving in politically manipulative ways when she runs for school board. She makes promises she may not keep. She appeals to voters' emotions rather than reason. She engages in the same kinds of political tactics she would normally criticize. When questioned about this, she rationalizes her behavior as necessary to win and to be able to do good once in office. A psychologist would recognize this as moral flexibility, where the person's standards for their own behavior differ from the standards they apply to others. Lois's parenting also shows contradictions between her stated values and her actual behavior. She claims to value treating all her children fairly and providing them with love and support. Yet her treatment of Meg is often dismissive or neglectful, while she shows more patience and attention to Chris and Stewie. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10 addresses this directly when Meg confronts the family about how they treat her. Lois must face the contradiction between her belief that she is a good mother and the reality that she has failed Meg in significant ways. A psychologist would consider what these contradictions reveal about Lois's internal state. The gap between who she presents herself as being and who she actually is suggests internal conflict and unmet psychological needs. Lois wants to be the responsible, moral, perfect wife and mother, yet she is also a person with her own needs for excitement, autonomy, recognition, and escape from the constant demands placed on her. When these needs go unmet through legitimate channels, they find expression through problematic behaviors. The episode Stewie Kills Lois from Season 6, though it turns out to be a simulation, shows a version of Lois who has been suppressing violent impulses and frustration. While this is fantasy within the show's reality, a psychologist would note that the willingness to depict Lois as capable of such darkness suggests the writers recognize that maintaining her responsible persona requires suppressing other aspects of her personality and emotional life. The contradictions we see in her actual behavior are mild expressions of impulses and needs that might be much stronger if fully unleashed. Lois's attitude towards sexuality also shows contradictions. She presents herself as conventional and proper in most contexts, yet episodes reveal that she has a more complex sexual history and more adventurous sexual interests than her public persona suggests. The episode Let's Go to the Hop from Season 2 includes references to Lois's past that contradict her current image as a traditional housewife. A psychologist would note that sexual expression is an area where social expectations for women are particularly constraining, and contradictions between public persona and private desires are common. The episode Model Misbehavior from Season 3 explores Lois returning to modeling, her career before marriage. As she re-engages with this world, aspects of her personality emerge that are normally suppressed in her family life. She becomes more focused on appearance, more competitive, more concerned with external validation. A psychologist would interpret this as revealing parts of herself that still exist, but that are incompatible with her primary identity as wife and mother. The contradictions in her behavior reflect these incompatible aspects of self. Financial decisions provide another area of contradiction. Lois presents herself as financially responsible and criticizes Peter for wasting money. Yet she also makes purchases the family cannot afford. She maintains standards of living that strain the budget, and she sometimes prioritizes appearances over financial prudence. The episode Death Has a Shadow shows Lois prioritizing having a nice Christmas even when the family's financial situation is uncertain. A psychologist would note that Lois's own relationship with money is more complex than her criticism of Peter suggests. The contradictions in Lois's behavior also appear in how she responds to Peter's actions. She criticizes his impulsivity and irresponsibility, yet she enables his behavior by continuing to rescue him from consequences. She says she wants him to change, yet her actions often make it possible for him to continue behaving the same way. A psychologist would recognize this as a codependent pattern, where Lois's sense of identity and purpose is tied to being needed by Peter, which creates an unconscious incentive for her to maintain the dynamic, even while consciously wanting it to change. The episode I Never Met the Dead Man from Season 1 shows this pattern. Peter gets the family's cable disconnected through his irresponsible behavior. Lois is angry and says Peter needs to face consequences. Yet, she ultimately helps him avoid the full consequences of his actions, allowing him to escape accountability. This pattern repeats throughout the series, revealing that Lois's actions contradict her stated desire for Peter to become more responsible. Honesty is another value where Lois shows contradictions. She claims to value honesty and teaches her children to tell the truth. Yet she lies to her parents about her life. She withholds information from Peter when she thinks the truth will cause problems, and she engages in deception when she believes it serves a good purpose. The episode The Kiss Seen Around the World from Season 3 shows Lois lying to protect Meg, rationalizing that the lie is justified because it prevents Meg from being hurt. A psychologist would note that Lois's morality is more situational than absolute, with her actual behavior revealing flexibility that her stated values do not acknowledge. These contradictions between values and behavior create psychological tension for Lois. Living with the awareness that you are not who you claim to be or who you want to be is psychologically uncomfortable. This discomfort might contribute to her emotional volatility, her occasional breakdowns, and her engagement in risky behaviors. The gap between ideal self and actual self is a source of shame and self-criticism that affects mental health and well-being. A psychologist would also consider how Lois's contradictions affect her relationships with family members. When she criticizes behavior in others that she also engages in herself, it creates resentment and undermines her authority. Her children and husband might be less likely to respect her guidance when they observe her failing to live by her own standards. This dynamic appears in several episodes where family members point out Lois's hypocrisy, reducing her credibility and effectiveness as the family's moral center. The episode 15 Minutes of Shame from Season 2 includes moments where the family's problematic dynamics are exposed publicly. Lois's contradictions become visible not just to the audience, but to the community. A psychologist would note that maintaining a false front requires energy and creates anxiety about being discovered. When Lois's contradictions are exposed, it likely produces shame and forces her to confront the gap between her self-image and reality. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These contradictions between values and behavior connect directly to how Lois approaches parenting, where the tensions between her intentions and her actual impact on her children become particularly visible and consequential. Section 5. Parenting: Protection, Neglect, and Bias. A psychologist observing Lois Griffin as a parent would notice immediately that her approach to parenting is not consistent across her 3 children, or even consistent with the same child over time. Her parenting patterns reveal the complexity of her psychology, showing how stress, personal needs, unconscious biases, and emotional capacity affect how she interacts with Meg, Chris, and Stewie. Understanding these patterns provides insight into how Lois manages the demands of motherhood while also revealing her limitations, her blind spots, and the ways her own unmet needs affect her children's development and well-being. Lois has 3 children who are very different from each other and who require different types of parenting. Meg is the oldest, a teenage daughter who struggles with social acceptance and self-esteem. Chris is the middle child, a son who is not academically gifted and who often acts impulsively. Stewie is the youngest, technically still a baby, though he speaks with advanced vocabulary and demonstrates genius-level intelligence that other characters, including Lois, do not seem to fully recognize or understand. Each child presents unique challenges, and a psychologist would pay attention to how Lois adapts her parenting, or fails to adapt, to meet each child's specific needs. The most striking pattern in Lois's parenting is her treatment of Meg compared to her other children. Throughout the series, Lois shows less patience, less emotional support, and less protection toward Meg than she shows toward Chris or Stewie. She dismisses Meg's concerns, ignores her emotional needs, and sometimes actively participates in the family's mistreatment of her oldest daughter. This differential treatment is psychologically significant because it suggests that Lois's capacity for parental warmth and attention is limited, and that she allocates it unevenly among her children. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10 addresses this pattern directly. In this episode, Meg finally confronts the family about how they treat her. She points out that everyone uses her as a target for their frustrations and that she receives none of the love and support that the other family members receive. Lois is present during this confrontation and must face the reality that she has failed Meg as a mother in fundamental ways. A psychologist would note that this episode reveals awareness within the show itself that Lois's parenting of Meg is inadequate and harmful. Earlier episodes established this pattern of neglect and dismissiveness toward Meg. In Let's Go to the Hop from Season 2, when Meg faces problems at school, Lois's response is less emotionally supportive than her responses tend to be when Chris or even Peter face difficulties. In Don't Make Me Over from Season 4, Lois tries to control Meg's appearance and choices rather than listening to what Meg actually wants or needs. Her interactions with Meg often feel transactional or controlling, rather than warm and nurturing. A psychologist would consider several possible explanations for this differential treatment. One possibility is that Meg reminds Lois of aspects of herself that she dislikes or has tried to suppress. Meg is awkward, insecure, and struggling socially, which might reflect parts of Lois's own adolescent experience or current feelings about herself. Seeing these qualities in Meg might trigger discomfort in Lois, leading her to distance herself emotionally from her daughter. Another possibility is that Lois unconsciously resents Meg for representing the responsibilities and constraints of motherhood. Meg was born when Lois was young, potentially limiting her opportunities and freedom. The pattern could also reflect simple emotional exhaustion. By the time Lois addresses Meg's needs, she has often already dealt with Peter's chaos, Stewie's demands, and Chris's problems. Her emotional resources are depleted, leaving little patience or warmth for Meg. A psychologist would recognize this as a common pattern in families, where one child's needs consistently get deprioritized because they are perceived as less urgent or because the parent simply runs out of energy. Lois's parenting of Chris shows more warmth and patience than her parenting of Meg. She responds to his academic struggles with attempts to help rather than with dismissiveness. She shows physical affection toward Chris more readily than toward Meg. She seems to find Chris's simplicity less threatening or challenging than Meg's emotional neediness and desire for connection. The episode Long John Peter from Season 6 shows Lois being protective and nurturing toward Chris when he faces problems, demonstrating a capacity for maternal warmth that Meg rarely receives. A psychologist would note that Chris requires less emotional sophistication from Lois. His needs are more straightforward, his problems are more concrete, and he does not challenge Lois in the ways that Meg sometimes does. This makes parenting Chris less emotionally demanding, which might explain why Lois has more patience and warmth available for him. Additionally, Lois might feel less pressure to shape Chris into a particular kind of person, while feeling more responsibility for molding Meg into someone who can navigate the world successfully. Lois's parenting of Stewie is complicated by the fact that she does not seem to fully understand him. Stewie speaks with adult vocabulary and has adult concerns, yet Lois often treats him as a normal baby. She does not respond to his actual communications in ways that suggest she hears and understands what he is saying. The episode Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, explores this dynamic, though the show is inconsistent about whether adults can understand Stewie. What remains consistent is that Lois treats Stewie with the protective instincts of a mother toward a baby, responding to physical needs while missing his emotional and intellectual complexity. A psychologist would observe that Lois's parenting of Stewie allows her to fulfill traditional maternal roles of feeding, changing, and physically caring for a baby without the emotional complexity that comes with parenting older children. Stewie does not ask her for emotional support in ways she must consciously refuse. He does not express disappointment in her that she must face. In this way, parenting Stewie might feel simpler and more satisfying to Lois, allowing her to feel like a good mother without the challenges that come with parenting Meg and Chris. The consistency of Lois's discipline is another area where a psychologist would notice significant problems. Lois does not maintain consistent rules or consequences across situations or across children. Sometimes she enforces boundaries strictly, while other times she ignores the same behaviors. This inconsistency creates confusion for her children about expectations and makes it difficult for them to learn from consequences. The episode And Then There Were Fewer from season 9 shows the family in a murder mystery situation, yet this episode is representative of a broader pattern where rules in the Griffin household are constantly shifting based on Lois's mood, stress level, and available energy. A psychologist would recognize that inconsistent discipline often stems from parental stress and limited resources. When Lois has energy and emotional capacity, she enforces rules and follows through with consequences. When she is exhausted or overwhelmed, she lets things slide because she does not have the strength to fight every battle. This creates an unpredictable environment for children where they cannot reliably know what to expect. Over time, this unpredictability can contribute to anxiety and insecurity. The episode Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows from season 3 shows Lois trying to manage the household while dealing with one of Peter's ridiculous situations. Her discipline of the children during this episode is minimal because her attention is focused elsewhere. A psychologist would note how external stressors affect Lois's ability to parent consistently, demonstrating that her parenting quality fluctuates based on other demands on her time and energy. Lois's parenting also shows moments of protection and genuine care that complicate the picture. She is not uniformly neglectful or harsh. The episode Road to Rupert from season 5 shows Lois being attentive to Stewie's distress over losing his teddy bear, demonstrating that she does notice and respond to her children's emotional needs at times. The episode Stewroids from season 7 shows her concern about Chris's safety and well-being. These moments reveal that Lois has capacity for good parenting when circumstances allow and when her own emotional state permits. A psychologist would interpret these inconsistencies as reflecting the reality that parenting quality depends on multiple factors, including the parent's emotional state, stress levels, available support, and the specific demands of each situation. Lois is not a consistently bad parent or a consistently good parent. She is a person trying to manage overwhelming demands with limited resources, and her parenting reflects this struggle. The episode Petarded from season 4 includes scenes where Lois must parent Peter after he is diagnosed with intellectual disability. This episode reveals how Lois's parenting strategies, developed for managing children, get applied to her husband as well. A psychologist would note that treating a spouse like a child creates unhealthy relationship dynamics and also depletes the emotional energy Lois has available for parenting her actual children. Lois's parenting is also affected by her own unmet needs for recognition, autonomy, and excitement. When she feels particularly trapped or unfulfilled, her capacity for patient, attentive parenting decreases. She becomes more irritable, more likely to snap at the children, more likely to withdraw emotionally. The shoplifting behavior revealed in Breaking Out is Hard to Do occurred during a period when Lois was presumably still responsible for parenting, suggesting that her own psychological distress was interfering with her ability to be present and available to her children. The episode Peterotica from season 4 shows the family dealing with Peter writing erotic novels. During this episode, Lois must maintain household functioning and parent the children while also managing her embarrassment and frustration. Her parenting during this time is distracted and less engaged than usual. A psychologist would recognize this as demonstrating how relationship stress affects parenting quality, creating a situation where children's needs get deprioritized when the parents are in conflict. Physical affection is another area where Lois shows differential treatment. She hugs and touches Chris more readily than she hugs Meg. She picks up and cuddles Stewie as babies are typically cuddled. With Meg, physical affection is notably absent in most episodes. A psychologist would note that children need physical affection from parents for healthy emotional development, and that the absence of this affection can contribute to feelings of rejection and unworthiness. The episode Meg and Quagmire from Season 10 shows Lois being protective when she believes Meg is in danger, demonstrating that her maternal instincts do extend to Meg in extreme situations. However, a psychologist would distinguish between crisis response and daily emotional availability. Lois can respond appropriately when there is an obvious threat to her child's safety, yet she fails to provide the consistent emotional support that children need regularly, particularly during adolescence. Lois's parenting also reflects societal and cultural expectations about motherhood that create pressure and guilt. She is expected to be nurturing, patient, selfless, and completely devoted to her children's well-being. When she fails to meet these expectations, she likely experiences shame and inadequacy. This shame might actually interfere with her ability to improve her parenting, creating a cycle where guilt about poor parenting leads to emotional withdrawal, which leads to worse parenting. The impact of Lois's parenting on her children's development is visible throughout the series. Meg's severe insecurity and desperate need for acceptance likely stem at least partly from inadequate emotional support at home. Chris's lack of confidence might reflect inconsistent encouragement from his mother. Stewie's elaborate fantasies and need for control might represent his response to an environment where his actual thoughts and feelings are not recognized by the adults around him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The struggles Lois faces in parenting directly connect to deeper questions about who she is beyond her role as mother, and how she searches for identity and validation outside the family structure that defines her daily existence. Section 6. Self-image and personal identity. A psychologist observing Lois Griffin would notice that her sense of personal identity appears fragmented and uncertain beyond her roles as wife and mother. Throughout the series, episodes show Lois attempting to reclaim or discover aspects of herself that exist independently of her family obligations. These attempts reveal deep questions about self-worth, validation, and the struggle to maintain individual identity while being consumed by family responsibilities. Understanding how Lois navigates identity formation provides insight into her psychological state and the internal conflicts that drive some of her more extreme behaviors. Identity is a fundamental psychological concept that refers to how people understand themselves, what makes them unique, and what gives their life meaning and purpose. For many people, identity includes multiple components, including career, relationships, values, interests, and personal qualities. For Lois, her identity has become almost entirely absorbed by her family roles. She is Peter's wife, Meg's mother, Chris's mother, Stewie's mother. These roles have crowded out almost everything else, leaving little room for Lois to exist as a separate person with her own interests and sense of self. The episode Model Misbehavior from Season 3 explores this identity struggle directly. In this episode, Lois returns to modeling, the career she had before marriage and motherhood. As she re-engages with this world, aspects of her personality emerge that are normally suppressed in family life. She becomes more focused on her appearance, more competitive with other models, more concerned with external validation and success. A psychologist would interpret this as revealing parts of Lois's identity that still exist within her, parts that were set aside when she chose family life over career. During her modeling return in that same episode, Lois receives attention and validation that she does not get at home. Other people notice her, admire her, treat her as valuable for reasons beyond her ability to manage a household or care for children. This external validation feeds a need that has gone unmet for years. A psychologist would recognize this as demonstrating that Lois craves recognition as an individual person with worth that is not dependent on her service to others. The conflict Lois experiences during this episode reveals the tension between different possible identities. She can be a model, successful and admired, or she can be a wife and mother, devoted to family. The show presents these as competing options rather than as identities that can coexist, which reflects real social pressures that women face about choosing between career and family. A psychologist would note that this false choice creates internal conflict for Lois, forcing her to reject parts of herself to fully embrace other parts. The episode Running Mates from Season 2 shows Lois running for school board, taking on a political role in her community. This represents another attempt to establish identity beyond her immediate family. As a school board member, she would have authority, influence, and a role that matters to people beyond her household. She campaigns actively, engages with community issues, and demonstrates competence in this political arena. A psychologist would observe that this episode shows Lois capable of leadership and public service when given the opportunity, suggesting that she has abilities that go unused in her daily family life. However, the school board role ultimately becomes another source of stress rather than fulfillment. Lois discovers that political positions come with their own pressures, conflicts, and moral compromises. She must navigate competing interests and manage criticism from people who disagree with her choices. A psychologist would note that this pattern, where attempts at identity expansion lead to disappointment, might reinforce Lois's resignation to her family roles. The episode Lois Comes Out of Her Shell from Season 11 shows Lois going through what appears to be a midlife crisis. She becomes interested in younger men, changes her appearance, and starts behaving in ways that seem designed to recapture her youth. A psychologist would interpret this as an identity crisis, a moment when Lois questions who she has become and attempts to reconnect with who she was before marriage and motherhood. The crisis suggests that she feels she has lost herself in her family roles and desperately wants to recover something of her earlier identity. During this period of crisis, Lois receives attention from younger men who find her attractive and interesting. This attention validates her sense of herself as a desirable woman rather than just as a mother and wife. A psychologist would recognize that midlife crises often involve attempts to resolve identity questions that were avoided or suppressed earlier in life. For Lois, these questions include whether she is still attractive, whether she has worth beyond her family service, and whether the choices she made were right for her. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10, while focused on time travel, includes moments where Lois sees herself at different life stages. Seeing her younger self reminds current Lois of who she was before the accumulated weight of family responsibilities. A psychologist would note that this kind of reflection, looking back at earlier versions of yourself, often triggers questions about identity and whether the path you have taken has been satisfying. Lois's past as a model and member of a wealthy family represents an alternate identity that she chose to leave behind. Episodes that reference her wealthy background, such as those featuring her father Carter Pewterschmidt, remind viewers and Lois herself that she once had access to a very different life. She had opportunities, resources, and social position that most people never experience. By marrying Peter, she rejected that identity and the possibilities that came with it. A psychologist would be interested in whether Lois experiences regret about this choice and how she manages any feelings of loss about the identity she abandoned. The episode The Story on Page 1 from Season 2 shows Lois supporting Peter in his various schemes while maintaining household responsibilities. During this episode, there was no space for Lois to explore her own interests or identity because Peter's needs dominate all available time and attention. A psychologist would observe how consistently this pattern appears throughout the series, with Lois's potential for individual identity development being crowded out by immediate family demands. Teaching piano is one area where Lois maintains a small piece of individual identity. Several episodes reference or show her musical abilities, suggesting that this talent predates her marriage and represents something that is authentically hers. The episode The King is Dead from Season 2 focuses on Lois directing a school play, allowing her musical and creative abilities to be recognized. A psychologist would note that these moments when Lois's talents are acknowledged provide her with satisfaction that is different from family service, suggesting that she needs opportunities to be competent and creative beyond household management. However, even activities like teaching piano or directing plays quickly become absorbed into family service. They are not purely for Lois's fulfillment. They involve the children, they serve community needs, they fit within acceptable boundaries for how mothers spend their time. A psychologist would observe that Lois struggles to claim space for activities that are purely about her own enjoyment or development. The episode Not All Dogs Go to Heaven from Season 7 includes moments where Lois defends her faith and values to Meg. During these interactions, Lois articulates beliefs and principles that seem to be genuinely her own, rather than adopted from Peter or shaped purely by family needs. A psychologist would recognize that having personal beliefs and values is an important component of identity, and that Lois's expression of these beliefs represents a part of her identity that exists independently of her family roles. Physical appearance is another dimension of identity that Lois navigates. She maintains herself and dresses appropriately, yet she is not obsessed with appearance in the way she was during her modeling days. The shift from model to suburban housewife involved accepting a less appearance-focused identity, though episodes occasionally show Lois being self-conscious about aging or about how she looks compared to other women. The episode The Thin White Line from Season 3 includes moments where Lois seems aware of her appearance. A psychologist would note that for women, appearance is often tied to identity in complex ways because society places so much emphasis on female attractiveness. Lois's former identity as a model was built on her appearance, and moving away from that identity required accepting that her worth would no longer come primarily from how she looks. However, societal messages about female attractiveness do not disappear just because a woman becomes a mother. The episode Family Guy Viewer Mail 1 from Season 3, though structured as anthology segments, includes moments that reveal different aspects of Lois's personality and potential identities. These alternative scenarios, while comedic, suggest that the writers recognize Lois has complexity and possibilities beyond what her normal family role allows her to express. A psychologist would be interested in these glimpses of alternative identities, seeing them as revealing desires or aspects of self that exist within Lois. Lois's relationship with other women in the community represents another dimension of identity formation. Female friendships can provide space for women to be themselves outside of family roles, to receive support and validation from peers, and to maintain identity separate from being someone's wife or mother. However, Lois's friendships are not deeply developed in this series. She has acquaintances and community connections, yet she does not appear to have close female friends who provide emotional support. The episode Halloween on Spooner Street from Season 9 shows Lois interacting with neighbors during community events. These interactions are pleasant yet superficial, suggesting that Lois maintains appropriate social connections without having deep relationships that might support identity development outside her family. A psychologist would note that the absence of strong friendships limits Lois's opportunities to explore aspects of herself that might not fit within her family roles. The pattern across these episodes reveals that Lois's attempts to reclaim or develop personal identity typically fail or are abandoned when they conflict with family needs. She returns to modeling, then stops. She runs for school board, then the role becomes complicated. She has a midlife crisis, then returns to normal functioning. Each attempt represents genuine desire for identity beyond family roles, yet each attempt is ultimately unsustainable given the demands placed on her. Self-esteem is closely tied to identity, and a psychologist would observe that Lois's self-esteem appears to fluctuate based on her success in family roles, rather than being grounded in a stable sense of personal worth. When she successfully manages family crises, she feels competent. When the family functions well, she feels valuable. When things fall apart, she feels like a failure. This means her self-esteem is hostage to factors she cannot control. The episode 15 Minutes of Shame from Season 2 shows the Griffin family on reality television, exposing their dysfunction to public scrutiny. Lois's embarrassment during this episode reveals that her sense of self includes concern about how others perceive her family. Her identity is not just about her individual qualities, but also about being part of a family unit that meets social standards. When the family fails to meet those standards publicly, it damages her self-esteem. A psychologist would also consider how Lois's identity questions reflect broader social questions about women's roles and worth. Traditional expectations tell women that their primary value comes from service to family, that personal ambitions should be secondary to family needs, and that good mothers sacrifice themselves for their children. Lois has internalized these messages, yet she also experiences the costs of living according to them. The fact that Lois keeps returning to her family roles despite dissatisfaction suggests either that she genuinely values these roles more than alternatives, or that she feels trapped by practical and emotional factors that make leaving impossible. A psychologist would be interested in understanding what mix of genuine commitment versus obligation keeps Lois in roles that often seem to cause her distress. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These questions about personal identity and self-worth connect intimately with how Lois navigates her marriage to Peter, where her sense of self becomes entangled with a partnership that both defines and confines her. Section 7. Marital Dynamics with Peter Griffin. The relationship between Lois and Peter Griffin is central to understanding Lois's psychology because this marriage shapes nearly every aspect of her daily life and emotional experience. A psychologist observing their marital dynamics would see a complex relationship that oscillates between devotion and frustration, between partnership and burden, between genuine connection and profound disappointment. The marriage reveals how Lois manages attachment, compromise, and the ongoing tension between her need for stability and Peter's constant creation of chaos. Lois and Peter's relationship began, as shown in flashback episodes, when Lois was young and attracted to Peter's authenticity and lack of pretension. The episode Meet the Quagmires from Season 5 shows a flashback to when they first met, revealing that Lois chose Peter over other options, including wealthy men who could have provided the comfortable life her family expected for her. A psychologist would note that this choice suggests Lois valued emotional connection and authenticity over material security, at least at that point in her life. The pilot episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1 establishes the basic dynamic that continues throughout the series. Peter loses his job and lies to Lois about it, rather than facing her reaction honestly. When Lois discovers the truth, she must deal with both the practical crisis Peter created and the betrayal of trust that came from his deception. She is angry and disappointed, yet she ultimately stays with Peter and works with him to resolve the situation. This pattern of Peter creating problems, Lois responding with anger and frustration, and the couple ultimately staying together despite the damage repeats constantly throughout the series. A psychologist would observe that Lois's attachment to Peter appears to be what psychologists call anxious preoccupied in some respects, meaning she remains committed to the relationship even when it consistently fails to meet her needs. She invests enormous energy in trying to make the marriage work, in managing Peter's behavior, in compensating for his failures. Yet Peter does not reciprocate this level of investment or effort. He behaves impulsively without considering how his actions affect Lois or the family. He fails to provide emotional support when Lois needs it, and he often dismisses her legitimate concerns about his behavior. The episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart from Season 3 shows Lois and Peter temporarily separating after discovering that they have both been unfaithful in their thoughts, if not their actions. During this separation, both characters must confront what the marriage means to them and whether they want to continue it. Lois dates other men during this period, exploring whether she might be happier with someone else. A psychologist would be interested in how Lois approaches these alternative relationships and what they reveal about what she needs from partnership. Ultimately, in that same episode, Lois and Peter reconcile and recommit to their marriage. The reconciliation suggests that despite all the problems, Lois believes the marriage is worth preserving. A psychologist would want to understand whether this belief stems from genuine love and commitment, from fear of being alone, from concern about disrupting the children's lives, from financial dependence on Peter, or from some combination of these factors. The show does not provide clear answers, leaving viewers and psychologists to interpret Lois's motivations based on her behavior across multiple episodes. The sexual dimension of Lois and Peter's relationship appears in many episodes, though the show handles this with varying degrees of explicitness given its animated comedy format. Episodes suggest that Lois and Peter maintain an active sexual relationship despite the other problems in their marriage. The episode A Mission Impossible from Season 3 involves the couple deciding whether to have another child, which requires them to discuss their sexual relationship and their family planning. A psychologist would note that sexual connection can sometimes sustain relationships even when other dimensions are troubled, providing physical intimacy that substitutes for emotional intimacy. However, episodes also show Lois feeling sexually frustrated or dissatisfied with aspects of their physical relationship. She sometimes expresses desire for more romance, more attention to her needs, or more consideration from Peter about what she finds attractive or appealing. The episode Screwed the Pooch from Season 3 includes references to their sexual relationship and suggests that Lois sometimes feels Peter takes her for granted, in this area as in others. Jealousy appears in their relationship from both sides. Episodes show Peter becoming jealous when other men pay attention to Lois, suggesting that he is aware of her attractiveness and concerned about losing her. The episode The Story on Page 1 from Season 2 includes moments where Peter reacts to other men finding Lois attractive. A psychologist would note that jealousy can indicate both insecurity and genuine attachment, suggesting that Peter does value Lois, even if his behavior often fails to demonstrate this value. Lois also experiences jealousy, though hers seems to focus more on Peter's time and attention than on sexual rivals. When Peter becomes obsessed with hobbies, jobs, or schemes that take him away from family, Lois resents the loss of his presence and participation. The episode Mind Over Murder from Season 1 shows Peter becoming completely absorbed in television, effectively abandoning his family responsibilities. Lois's frustration during this episode reveals her need for Peter to be present and engaged, rather than constantly distracted by whatever currently interests him. The power dynamics in the marriage are complex and shift depending on the situation. In practical matters of household management and child rearing, Lois has more power because she is the competent one who actually manages these responsibilities. Peter defers to her judgment in these areas, though often only after creating problems that she must resolve. In financial matters, Peter technically has more power because he earns the family's income, yet Lois manages the budget and makes most day-to-day financial decisions. In major life decisions, Peter often acts unilaterally without consulting Lois, exercising power through impulsiveness rather than through legitimate authority. The episode Patriot Games from Season 4 demonstrates this dynamic. Peter decides to join the New England Patriots football team without discussing this major life change with Lois. She must adapt to this new reality, managing the household around Peter's schedule and dealing with the consequences of his new fame. A psychologist would observe that Peter's pattern of making major decisions unilaterally shows disrespect for Lois's role as his partner and disregard for how his choices affect her life. Communication patterns in the marriage reveal significant dysfunction. Lois often tries to communicate directly with Peter about problems, expressing her feelings and needs clearly. However, Peter frequently fails to listen, dismisses her concerns, or forgets what she said immediately after hearing it. The episode Petarded from Season 4, while focused on Peter's intellectual disability diagnosis, reveals communication patterns that exist throughout their marriage. Lois must repeat herself constantly, must simplify her communication to get through to Peter, and must accept that much of what she says will not be retained or acted upon. This communication failure creates frustration and loneliness for Lois. She has a partner who is physically present yet emotionally unavailable for genuine communication much of the time. A psychologist would recognize this as a form of emotional neglect within marriage, where one partner's needs for connection, understanding, and meaningful exchange go unmet because the other partner is incapable of or unwilling to provide them. The episode I Take Thee Quagmire from Season 4 shows Lois and Peter attending Quagmire's wedding, which provides opportunities for them to reflect on their own marriage. Weddings often trigger reflection about marital satisfaction, and a psychologist would be interested in what Lois thinks and feels when observing other couples. Does she compare her marriage to others? Does she feel satisfied or regretful? The episode does not provide clear answers, yet the questions themselves are psychologically significant. Financial stress affects the marriage significantly. Peter's impulsive decisions often create financial crises that Lois must manage. He quits jobs without having other employment lined up. He makes large purchases the family cannot afford. He gambles or wastes money on schemes. Each of these actions creates practical problems that strain the marriage. The episode Death Has a Shadow establishes this pattern in the pilot, and it continues throughout the series. A psychologist would note that financial conflict is one of the most common sources of marital stress and divorce, and the Griffin marriage shows why this is true. The episode Lethal Weapons from Season 3 shows conflict arising when Lois learns martial arts and becomes physically stronger than Peter. Peter feels threatened by Lois's new abilities, revealing insecurity about masculinity and power in the relationship. Lois must navigate Peter's jealousy and discomfort while also enjoying her new skills and confidence. A psychologist would observe how this episode reveals assumptions both partners hold about gender roles and power dynamics in marriage. Support and caregiving flow primarily from Lois to Peter, rather than being reciprocal. When Peter faces problems, Lois helps him. When Lois faces problems, she typically must handle them herself because Peter is unavailable, unhelpful, or actively making things worse. The episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do from Season 4 shows this clearly. When Lois goes to prison for shoplifting, Peter must temporarily take over household management. He struggles enormously with tasks that Lois handles daily, revealing how much he depends on her while providing little support in return. The episode The Thin White Line from Season 3 focuses on Brian's cocaine addiction, yet it also reveals marital dynamics between Lois and Peter. During this crisis, they must work together to help Brian, providing a rare example of them functioning as partners addressing a problem together. A psychologist would note how unusual this collaborative problem-solving is compared to their typical pattern where Lois handles problems while Peter creates them. Humor plays an important role in their relationship. Peter makes Lois laugh, and this shared humor seems to be one thing that sustains their connection despite other problems. Episodes show Lois genuinely enjoying Peter's antics at times, finding his childlike enthusiasm charming rather than frustrating. A psychologist would recognize that shared humor and the ability to laugh together can be significant protective factors in relationships, helping couples navigate stress and maintain connection even when other areas are troubled. The episode Family Guy Viewer Mail 1 from Season 3, though structured as anthology segments, includes alternate reality versions of Lois and Peter's relationship that provide insight into their dynamic. These alternatives reveal different possibilities for how their relationship might function, suggesting that the writers recognized the marriage could take different forms under different circumstances. Lois's parents, particularly her father Carter, consistently expressed disapproval of Peter and the marriage. Episodes featuring the Pewterschmidt family show Carter treating Peter with contempt and suggesting that Lois made a terrible mistake. This external pressure on the marriage likely affects how Lois thinks about her choices. A psychologist would be interested in whether defending her marriage against her parents' criticism makes Lois more committed to it, creating a sense that she must prove her choice was correct, even if she has doubts. The episode Jungle Love from Season 4 shows Peter running away to live in the jungle, abandoning his family. Lois tracks him down and brings him back, demonstrating her commitment to keeping the marriage and family intact, even when Peter tries to escape. A psychologist would observe that Lois consistently works to maintain the relationship, while Peter's commitment appears more ambivalent, creating an imbalance where one partner invests far more than the other. Anniversary celebrations and romantic occasions appear occasionally in episodes, showing how the couple marks their relationship milestones. These occasions typically involve some mixture of genuine affection and comic mishaps, reflecting the overall tone of their marriage. A psychologist would note that the couple has been together for many years despite all the problems, suggesting some foundation of attachment or commitment that sustains them through repeated crises. The long-term nature of the marriage means that Lois and Peter have extensive shared history. They have been through countless experiences together, raised children together, and built a life together, despite its chaos and dysfunction. This shared history creates bonds that are difficult to break, even when current satisfaction is low. A psychologist would recognize that long-term relationships develop inertia, where the investment already made makes leaving feel costly, even when staying is unsatisfying. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The marital dynamics that create both stability and stress in Lois's life connect directly to her impulse control and risk-taking behaviors, which emerge as responses to the constraints and frustrations her marriage imposes. Section 8. Impulse control and risk-taking. A psychologist observing Lois Griffin across multiple episodes would notice a striking pattern in her relationship with impulse control and risk-taking behavior. Lois presents herself as the responsible, controlled adult in her family, the person who thinks before acting and considers consequences. Yet episodes throughout the series reveal moments when Lois acts impulsively, takes significant risks, or engages in behavior that directly contradicts her usual careful approach to life. Understanding this pattern provides insight into the psychological pressure she experiences and how that pressure seeks release through actions that feel out of character yet are deeply revealing of her internal state. The most dramatic example of Lois's impulse control failure appears in the episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do from Season 4. This episode reveals that Lois has been shoplifting regularly, stealing items from stores for the thrill rather than because she needs the items or cannot afford them. A psychologist would immediately recognize shoplifting as an impulse control disorder when it becomes repetitive and when the motivation is excitement rather than necessity. The fact that Lois, who presents herself as law-abiding and responsible, engages in repeated theft indicates serious problems with managing impulses and with finding healthy outlets for psychological needs. The shoplifting behavior reveals several things about Lois's impulse control. First, it shows that beneath her controlled exterior, Lois experiences strong urges toward excitement and risk that she normally suppresses. The shoplifting provides a rush of adrenaline, a moment of feeling alive and free that her daily routine does not offer, Second, it demonstrates that when impulses are suppressed too rigidly for too long, they eventually find expression in destructive ways. Lois does not give herself permission to seek excitement through legitimate channels, so the need for stimulation emerges through theft. Third, it reveals that Lois's self-control, while appearing strong on the surface, is actually more fragile than it seems. The shoplifting has been happening repeatedly before she gets caught, suggesting an ongoing pattern rather than a single impulsive mistake. When Lois gets arrested and goes to prison in that same episode, she has an emotional breakdown that connects her impulse control failure to her overall psychological state. She cries and talks about feeling overwhelmed, trapped, and exhausted by her life. A psychologist would interpret this breakdown as revealing that the shoplifting was a symptom of deeper distress. The impulse control problem was not really about stealing objects. It was about needing some form of escape, excitement, or control in a life that felt increasingly constricting and unbearable. The thrill of theft provided temporary relief from the monotony and stress of her daily existence, offering moments when she felt powerful and alive, rather than trapped and diminished. Gambling is another area where Lois shows impulse control problems. Several episodes reference or depict Lois gambling, sometimes to concerning degrees. The episode Patriot Games from Season 4 includes references to Lois betting on sporting events. While the show treats this lightly, a psychologist would note that gambling can become addictive precisely because it provides excitement, risk, and the possibility of reward in a way that activates the same brain systems that respond to other addictive behaviors. For someone like Lois, who feels starved for excitement and stimulation, gambling offers temporary satisfaction of those needs. The psychological mechanism behind gambling addiction involves the unpredictable nature of rewards, which creates stronger behavioral patterns than predictable rewards. When Lois places a bet, she does not know whether she will win or lose, and this uncertainty creates excitement and anticipation that her predictable daily routine cannot provide. A psychologist would recognize that Lois's attraction to gambling likely stems from the same underlying needs that drove her shoplifting behavior: the need for excitement, unpredictability, and experiences that make her feel something other than the constant low-level stress and boredom of household management. The impulse control issues appear in contrast to the extreme control Lois usually maintains. Most of the time, Lois regulates her behavior carefully, thinking through consequences, managing her reactions, and suppressing urges that might create problems. This high level of control requires significant psychological energy. A psychologist would observe that maintaining such tight control over extended periods creates internal pressure that eventually must find release. The impulse control failures represent moments when that pressure overwhelms Lois's capacity to contain it. The episode Lois Comes Out of Her Shell from Season 11 shows Lois acting impulsively during what appears to be a midlife crisis. She pursues younger men, changes her appearance dramatically, and behaves in ways that seem designed to recapture youth and excitement. A psychologist would interpret this episode as showing impulse control breaking down during a period of identity crisis and emotional distress. When Lois questions who she is and feels dissatisfied with her life, her usual careful control over her behavior weakens, allowing impulses toward excitement and validation to direct her actions. Risk-taking in relationships also appears in Lois's behavior. The episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart from Season 3 reveals that Lois has been tempted by other men and has come close to infidelity, even if she has not crossed that line definitively. This willingness to risk her marriage by entertaining romantic attention from others indicates that Lois sometimes acts on impulses despite knowing the potential consequences. A psychologist would note that relationship infidelity often stems from unmet needs within the primary relationship, combined with opportunities that appeal to impulses toward excitement, validation, or escape. The contrast between Lois's impulsive behaviors and her cautious behaviors is psychologically revealing. In areas related to her children's safety, Lois is extremely cautious. She worries about where they go, what they do, and whether they might be in danger. The episode A Fish Out of Water from Season 3 shows Lois being protective and concerned about safety during a family vacation. She sets rules about swimming, about activities, about bedtime. This cautiousness about her children's well-being stands in stark contrast to her risk-taking in areas like shoplifting or gambling. A psychologist would interpret this contrast as showing that Lois's impulse control and risk tolerance depend on context. When she feels responsible for protecting others, particularly her children, She maintains strict control and avoids risks. When acting in domains that feel like they are about her own needs rather than about protecting others, her control weakens and risk-taking increases. This pattern suggests that Lois gives herself permission to be reckless with her own well-being in ways she would never permit regarding her children. She protects them carefully while putting herself at risk, revealing how little value she places on her own safety and happiness compared to theirs. The episode Model Misbehavior from Season 3 shows Lois taking risks related to her appearance and her modeling career. She competes with other models, she invests time and emotional energy in a career that might not succeed, she risks disappointment and failure. While these risks are less obviously destructive than shoplifting, they still represent Lois acting on impulses toward excitement and validation, rather than maintaining her usual cautious approach. The decision to return to modeling involves risking her self-image and opening herself to rejection in ways that her safe household role never requires. Alcohol consumption is another area where Lois shows variable impulse control. Most episodes show her drinking moderately and responsibly. However, some episodes depict her drinking more heavily, using alcohol to cope with stress or to escape from her problems temporarily. The episode The Thin White Line from Season 3 focuses on addiction issues in the family, and while Brian's cocaine use is the main focus, Lois's relationship with alcohol appears in the background as another form of using substances to manage psychological distress. A psychologist would recognize that alcohol serves as a way to temporarily reduce inhibitions and to escape from emotional pain, making it attractive to someone under chronic stress. A psychologist would observe that people with strong external control, meaning they regulate their behavior based on rules and expectations, sometimes struggle more with impulse control than people who have developed strong internal control, meaning they regulate based on personal values and genuine preference. Lois seems to regulate largely based on external factors, including what is expected of her, what will happen if she fails to control herself, and what others will think. This external control works well much of the time, yet it can fail when the external constraints weaken or when internal pressure becomes strong enough to overwhelm external controls. The episode Jungle Love from Season 4 shows Lois acting on impulse when she tracks Peter to the jungle and uses deception to bring him home. Her methods are questionable, and her decision to pursue him involves risks including travel to a foreign location, confronting an unpredictable situation, and potentially failing to convince Peter to return. A psychologist would note that when Lois feels strongly motivated by emotions like fear or love, she acts more impulsively, setting aside her usual careful planning. The urgency of the situation overrides her typical cautious approach. Physical risks appear less frequently in Lois's behavior compared to social or legal risks, yet they do occur. The episode Lethal Weapons from Season 3 shows Lois learning martial arts and then using those skills in ways that create physical danger for herself and others. While learning martial arts itself is not necessarily impulsive, how she uses those skills suggests some willingness to engage in physical conflict and risk that contrasts with her usual avoidance of such situations. The martial arts give her a sense of power and capability that she normally lacks, and she acts on impulses to use this power even when doing so creates problems. The relationship between Lois's impulse control and her emotional state is clear across episodes. When she feels particularly stressed, trapped, or dissatisfied, her impulse control weakens. When she feels more satisfied and less pressured, she maintains better control. This pattern indicates that impulse control is not a fixed personality trait for Lois. Instead, it fluctuates based on her psychological resources and stress levels. A psychologist would recognize this as normal human functioning, where self-control depends partly on having adequate emotional and cognitive resources available. When those resources are depleted by chronic stress, impulse control becomes much more difficult. The episode Road to Rupert from Season 5 shows Lois generally maintaining good control even during a stressful situation, demonstrating that she does have capacity for regulation when she chooses to exercise it, or when circumstances support it. However, the contrast with episodes like Breaking Out is Hard to Do reveals how variable her control can be, depending on internal and external factors. The difference seems to depend on whether the stress is acute and manageable, or chronic and overwhelming. Planning and spontaneity represent another dimension of impulse control that appears in Lois's character. Most of the time, Lois plans carefully, thinking ahead about what needs to happen and organizing accordingly. The episode Peterbus Unum from Season 2 shows her managing practical realities during Peter's declaration of independence, demonstrating her typical planning and organizational approach. However, when she acts impulsively through shoplifting or other risky behaviors, planning disappears in favor of acting on immediate urges without considering long-term consequences. This shift from careful planning to impulsive action reveals how dramatically her functioning can change when psychological pressure becomes too great. A psychologist would also consider how Lois's impulse control problems affect her relationships and her self-image. When she acts impulsively and faces consequences, she likely experiences shame and guilt that damage her sense of herself as responsible and controlled. These negative feelings might actually contribute to future impulse control problems by creating emotional distress that then seeks relief through more impulsive behavior. This creates a problematic cycle where impulse control failure leads to negative emotions that reduce future impulse control capacity. The shame of having shoplifted or having acted recklessly does not strengthen her control. Instead, it creates more distress that makes future failures more likely. The episode 15 Minutes of Shame from Season 2 shows the family's behavior being exposed publicly, though this episode focuses more on the family as a whole than specifically on Lois's impulse control. However, a psychologist would note that public exposure of impulse control failures, like what happens when Lois gets arrested for shoplifting, creates additional shame and stress that compound the original problem. The arrest means that her loss of control is no longer private. It becomes public knowledge, damaging her reputation and forcing her to face judgment from the community. The pattern of suppression and eruption that characterizes Lois's emotional regulation also applies to her impulse control. She suppresses urges and maintains control for extended periods, then experiences eruptions where control breaks down completely. A psychologist would prefer to see more consistent, moderate expression of needs, rather than this pattern of rigid control followed by breakdown. If Lois could find legitimate ways to meet her needs for excitement, autonomy, and escape, her impulse control might improve because the pressure driving impulsive behavior would be reduced. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of impulse and restraint that characterize Lois's private struggles become even more complex when examined through her social behavior and interactions with the broader community beyond her immediate family. Section 9. Social Behavior and External Roles. A psychologist, observing how Lois Griffin interacts with people outside her immediate family, would notice patterns that reveal much about her values, her social identity, and how she manages the gap between her private struggles and her public presentation. Lois's social behavior includes interactions with neighbors, community members, extended family, and various social institutions. These interactions show a person trying to maintain respectability and social standing while dealing with a family that constantly threatens to embarrass her or damage her reputation. Understanding Lois's social behavior provides insight into what she values, how she presents herself to the world, and the additional stress that comes from managing her family's public image. Lois participates actively in community life in Quahog, Rhode Island. She attends PTA meetings, she volunteers for community events, she engages with neighbors, and she tries to be a visible, contributing member of her town. The episode Running Mates from Season 2 shows this community engagement clearly when Lois runs for school board. She campaigns, she attends meetings, she speaks publicly about issues that matter to parents and community members. A psychologist would observe that this community involvement represents something important to Lois, a role that extends beyond her family and that connects her to a broader social world. The school board campaign in that episode reveals how Lois approaches social roles outside her family. She is competent and articulate. She understands the issues. She can organize a campaign and communicate effectively with voters. These abilities suggest that Lois could be successful in various professional or civic roles if she had more time and freedom to pursue them. However, the campaign also reveals the stress that comes from taking on additional responsibilities when her family life already demands so much. A psychologist would note the tension between Lois wanting to contribute to her community and the practical reality that she has limited time and energy available. Lois's relationship with her neighbors appears in multiple episodes, revealing patterns in how she manages these local social connections. She wants to be liked and respected by her neighbors. She cares about how the Griffin family is perceived in the neighborhood. When Peter does something outrageous that affects the community, Lois experiences embarrassment and concern about social consequences. The episode Peterbus Unum from Season 2 demonstrates this when Peter declares the Griffin house an independent nation. Lois must deal with the social fallout of Peter's behavior, managing relationships with neighbors who are affected by his actions. A psychologist would observe that Lois functions as the family's social ambassador, the person responsible for maintaining acceptable relationships with the outside world. This role requires significant emotional labor. She must apologize for Peter's behavior, she must smooth over conflicts, she must present the family as normal and acceptable, even when their actual functioning is chaotic and dysfunctional. This gap between public presentation and private reality creates psychological strain because it requires constant vigilance and impression management. The episode 15 Minutes of Shame from Season 2 shows the Griffin family on reality television, exposing their dysfunction to a much wider audience than just their neighborhood. Lois's horror at this public exposure reveals how much she values privacy, and how important it is to her that the family's problems remain hidden from public view. A psychologist would recognize this concern about public image as reflecting both genuine care about reputation and also shame about the family's actual functioning. If Lois felt proud of how her family functioned, public exposure would not be so threatening. The fact that she dreads it suggests she knows the family does not meet social standards and that she feels responsible for this failure. Lois's relationship with her extended family, particularly her parents, Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, reveals another dimension of her social behavior. Her father, Carter, is wealthy, powerful, and deeply disapproving of Peter and the life Lois has chosen. Episodes featuring the Pewterschmidt family show Lois navigating a complex dynamic where she tries to maintain family connections while also defending her choices and her husband. The episode, The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns from Season 4 includes interactions between Lois and her parents that reveal this ongoing tension. A psychologist would note that Lois's relationship with her parents affects her sense of identity and her feelings about her life choices. When her father expresses disappointment in her, it likely triggers doubts about whether she made the right decisions. When he criticizes Peter, she must defend her husband, even when she privately agrees with some of the criticism. This creates internal conflict, where Lois must reconcile her own frustrations with Peter with her need to present a united front to her parents. The social role of dutiful daughter who defends her marriage conflicts with her private experience of dissatisfaction and frustration. Church attendance and religious participation appear occasionally in episodes, showing another aspect of Lois's social life and community involvement. The episode Not All Dogs Go to Heaven from Season 7 shows Lois defending her Christian faith to Meg, revealing that religion is part of Lois's identity and value system. A psychologist would observe that religious communities provide social support, shared values, and a sense of belonging that can be particularly important for parents seeking to raise children with moral guidance. Lois's religious participation likely serves multiple functions, including genuine faith, social connection, and desire to provide moral education for her children. However, as discussed in earlier sections, Lois's actual behavior does not always align with the values her religion teaches. She shoplifts, she gambles, she lies, she engages in various behaviors that contradict religious teachings about honesty, respect for property, and living according to moral principles. A psychologist would recognize this gap between religious identity and actual behavior as another form of the cognitive dissonance that appears throughout Lois's psychology. She wants to be seen as a good Christian woman, and she likely wants to actually be that person, yet her behavior repeatedly falls short of this ideal. Lois's interactions with other women in the community reveal patterns in how she forms and maintains friendships. Unlike Peter, who has close friendships with Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland, Lois does not appear to have deep, sustained friendships with other women. She has acquaintances, she interacts pleasantly with neighbors, yet she does not seem to have close female friends who provide emotional support or with whom she can be fully honest about her struggles. The episode Model Misbehavior from Season 3 shows Lois interacting with other women in the modeling world, though these interactions are competitive rather than supportive. A psychologist would consider why Lois lacks close female friendships. One possibility is that she simply does not have time, given her family responsibilities. Another possibility is that she finds it difficult to be vulnerable with other women, because doing so would require admitting that her life is not what she wants it to be, and that she is struggling significantly. Maintaining the appearance that everything is fine requires keeping people at a distance emotionally. Close friendships require honesty and vulnerability that Lois might not feel safe providing. The absence of close friendships means Lois lacks an important source of social support that could help buffer the stress of her family life. Women's friendships often provide opportunities to share experiences, to receive validation that you are not alone in your struggles, and to get practical advice from people facing similar challenges. Without these friendships, Lois is more isolated and has fewer resources for coping with stress. A psychologist would see this isolation as increasing her vulnerability to the various psychological problems we have discussed, including depression, anxiety, and impulse control failures. Lois's behavior at social events reveals how she tries to present herself to the community. At parties, gatherings, or public events, Lois typically dresses appropriately, behaves politely, and tries to ensure that her family does not embarrass themselves or her. The episode I Take Thee, Quagmire from Season 4 shows the family attending Quagmire's wedding, where Lois tries to manage everyone's behavior so they do not ruin the event. A psychologist would observe that Lois expends significant energy on managing impressions and maintaining social acceptability, energy that might be better used on addressing the underlying problems in her family. Conflict in social situations reveals another aspect of Lois's personality. While she generally tries to maintain harmony and avoid confrontation, episodes show that Lois can be assertive or even aggressive when she feels sufficiently provoked or when defending her family. The episode Lethal Weapons from Season 3 shows Lois using martial arts in public situations, demonstrating a capacity for confrontation that normally remains hidden. A psychologist would note that Lois's social behavior is not uniformly passive or accommodating. She has capacity for assertiveness and even aggression that emerges under specific circumstances. However, the assertiveness and aggression Lois shows in defending herself or her family differs from the kind of authentic self-expression that comes from being comfortable with who you are. Lois's confrontational moments often seem reactive, driven by anger or fear, rather than by confident assertion of her rights or needs. A psychologist would distinguish between reactive aggression that emerges when control breaks down, and proactive assertiveness that comes from genuine confidence and self-knowledge. Lois shows more of the former than the latter. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10, where Meg confronts the family about their mistreatment of her, occurs during a situation where the family is isolated from the community due to a hurricane. A psychologist would note that this confrontation happens when normal social constraints are suspended, and when the family cannot escape to external activities or relationships. When forced to face each other without the buffer of social obligations and community engagement, the family's dysfunction becomes impossible to ignore. Lois's participation in mistreating Meg is revealed as something that happens both privately and as part of the family's internal dynamic. Lois's role in the broader Quahog community includes being seen as a responsible parent and citizen, yet this reputation is constantly threatened by Peter's behavior and by occasional revelations of the family's dysfunction. The shoplifting arrest and breaking out is hard to do damages Lois's social standing because it reveals that she is not the person she appeared to be. A psychologist would recognize that threats to social standing create anxiety for people who value community acceptance and who have built their identity partly on being seen as respectable and responsible. The way Lois handles social obligations reveals her priorities and values. She remembers birthdays, she sends thank you notes, she participates in expected social rituals. These behaviors demonstrate respect for social norms and desire to maintain harmonious relationships. The episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1 shows Lois trying to maintain normal holiday celebrations despite financial crisis, revealing that social rituals and maintaining appearances matter to her, even when practical circumstances make this difficult. A psychologist would also observe how Lois's social behavior reflects gender expectations and traditional female roles. Women in communities are often expected to maintain social connections, to organize events, to remember important occasions, and to manage the family's social calendar. Lois fulfills these expectations, taking on yet another form of invisible labor that is required for the family to function socially. She ensures the children go to birthday parties, she coordinates with other parents, she manages the social logistics that allow the family to be part of their community. The episode, The Story on Page 1 from Season 2, shows Lois dealing with social consequences when Peter pursues journalism and creates conflicts in the community. Lois must manage relationships that Peter damages through his actions, apologizing and smoothing things over so the family can continue living peacefully in Quahog. A psychologist would note that this pattern of Peter creating social problems and Lois managing the fallout parallels the dynamic in other areas of their life together. Volunteer work and community service appear occasionally in Lois's activities, showing her desire to contribute positively to her community. However, a psychologist might question whether this volunteer work stems from genuine desire to help others, or from pressure to fulfill expectations about what good mothers and wives do. The motivation matters because work done from authentic caring provides psychological satisfaction, while work done purely from obligation can become another source of stress and resentment. The relationship between Lois's social behavior and her internal psychology reveals someone trying to maintain an acceptable public identity while struggling privately with dissatisfaction, stress, and unmet needs. The gap between how she appears socially and how she feels internally creates the kind of disconnection from authentic self that contributes to many of the problems we have discussed. A psychologist would recognize that when you cannot be honest about who you are and what you are experiencing, when you must always present a false front to the world, it becomes harder to know yourself and to address problems in effective ways. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These social patterns and the tension between public presentation and private reality directly reflect the deeper cognitive dissonance Lois experiences between the values she claims to hold and the actions she actually takes. Section 10. Cognitive dissonance. Values versus actions. A psychologist observing Lois Griffin would identify cognitive dissonance as one of the most important psychological concepts for understanding her character. Cognitive dissonance refers to the mental discomfort that occurs when a person holds contradictory beliefs or when their behavior contradicts their stated values and self-image. Lois experiences significant cognitive dissonance throughout the series because what she says she believes and how she actually behaves are often in conflict. Understanding this dissonance helps explain many of Lois's emotional struggles, her defensive reactions, and the psychological strategies she uses to manage the gap between who she claims to be and who she actually is. Lois presents herself as someone who values honesty, responsibility, law-abiding behavior, and traditional family values. She criticizes Peter and the children when they behave irresponsibly or break rules. She expresses moral judgments about right and wrong. She positions herself as the ethical center of the family, the person who maintains standards and tries to guide others toward better behavior. This self-presentation suggests that Lois sees herself as morally upright, that she believes certain principles should guide human behavior, and that she judges herself and others by these standards. However, as we have discussed in previous sections, Lois's actual behavior frequently contradicts these stated values. She shoplifts despite believing people should respect property and follow laws. She gambles despite criticizing Peter for wasting money on risky ventures. She lies to her parents, to Peter, and to others despite claiming to value honesty. She treats Meg poorly, despite believing that good mothers should love and support all their children equally. Each of these contradictions creates cognitive dissonance, forcing Lois to manage the psychological discomfort that comes from recognizing that her behavior does not match her values. The episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do from Season 4 reveals the shoplifting behavior and shows Lois's breakdown when confronted with the consequences of her actions. During this breakdown, Lois expresses feeling overwhelmed and trapped, suggesting that the shoplifting stemmed from desperation and stress rather than from genuine disregard for her stated values. A psychologist would recognize this as Lois trying to reduce cognitive dissonance by explaining her behavior in ways that make it less contradictory to her self-image. She is not really a thief who disrespects property rights. She is a stressed woman who made poor choices while coping with overwhelming demands. This reframing allows her to maintain her self-image as fundamentally good, while acknowledging that her behavior was wrong. A psychologist would observe that people manage cognitive dissonance through several strategies. They can change their behavior to match their values, which would be the most direct solution. They can change their values to justify their behavior, which allows them to avoid feelings of guilt or hypocrisy. They can minimize the importance of the inconsistency, telling themselves it does not really matter. Or they can create elaborate rationalizations that explain why the apparent contradiction is not actually contradictory when you understand the full context. Lois appears to use primarily the minimization and rationalization strategies rather than actually changing her behavior or honestly revising her values. The episode Running Mates from Season 2 shows Lois engaging in political tactics during her school board campaign that contradict her stated values about honesty and integrity. She makes promises she might not keep. She appeals to emotions rather than presenting purely factual information. She uses strategies that she would likely criticize if she saw others using them. When Peter or someone else questions her about this, Lois rationalizes her behavior by saying that you have to do these things to win elections, and that winning is necessary so she can do good work once in office. A psychologist would recognize this as a classic rationalization that reduces cognitive dissonance by reframing questionable means as justified by good ends. Lois's treatment of Meg creates particularly severe cognitive dissonance because Lois surely knows, on some level, that good mothers do not neglect or mistreat their children. Yet she participates in the family's pattern of dismissing Meg and treating her as less worthy of love and attention than the other children. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10 forces this contradiction into the open when Meg confronts the family directly. Lois must face the reality that she has failed as a mother in ways that contradict everything she believes about what mothers should be. A psychologist would observe that confronting this kind of fundamental failure creates intense psychological distress. Lois's identity as a good mother is central to her self-concept. If she fully accepts that she has badly failed Meg, she must revise her entire understanding of who she is. This revision would be psychologically devastating, requiring her to acknowledge that much of what she has believed about herself is false. To avoid this devastating realization, Lois likely uses various defensive strategies, including denial, minimization, and rationalization. She might tell herself that Meg is fine, that the mistreatment is not as bad as it appears, or that Meg brought some of the problems on herself through her personality or behavior. The contradiction between Lois's stated commitment to family and her actual enabling of family dysfunction creates ongoing cognitive dissonance. Lois says she wants the family to function better. She says she wants Peter to be more responsible, the children to behave appropriately, and the household to run smoothly. Yet her actions often enable the very dysfunction she claims to oppose. She rescues Peter from consequences that might teach him to behave differently. She gives up on disciplining the children consistently. She accepts situations that make her miserable rather than demanding real change. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting ambivalence, where part of Lois genuinely wants change, while another part of her benefits from keeping things as they are. The benefit Lois gains from maintaining family dysfunction might not be obvious or conscious. However, a psychologist would consider that Lois's identity as the competent one, the person who holds everything together, depends on Peter and the children continuing to be incompetent and chaotic. If Peter became truly responsible and the children became self-sufficient, Lois might lose her sense of purpose and her feeling of being needed. The dysfunction that exhausts and frustrates her also provides meaning and validates her importance to the family. This creates cognitive dissonance because Lois consciously wants the family to improve, while unconsciously having reasons to maintain the status quo. The episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart from season 3 shows Lois confronting issues of trust and commitment in her marriage. She discovers that Peter has been looking at other women, and she must face her own temptations toward infidelity. A psychologist would note that this episode makes explicit the cognitive dissonance around Lois's commitment to her marriage. She believes in marital fidelity and presents herself as devoted to Peter, yet she experiences attraction to other men and has come close to acting on that attraction. This contradiction between stated values about marriage and actual feelings and behaviors creates discomfort that the episode forces both Lois and Peter to address. Lois's religious faith creates another area of cognitive dissonance. The episode Not All Dogs Go to Heaven from season 7 shows Lois defending Christianity and expressing that faith matters to her. Christian teachings emphasize forgiveness, compassion, honesty, and selfless love. Yet Lois's behavior frequently contradicts these principles. She is not particularly forgiving, she can be harsh and dismissive, she lies regularly, and her love for her family often seems conditional on them meeting her expectations. A psychologist would observe that maintaining religious identity while behaving in ways that contradict religious teachings requires significant mental gymnastics to manage the resulting cognitive dissonance. People who experience religious cognitive dissonance often manage it by compartmentalizing, keeping their religious beliefs separate from their everyday behavior and not examining the contradictions too closely. Alternatively, they might selectively apply religious teachings, emphasizing parts that align with their behavior while ignoring parts that would require change. Lois appears to use both strategies, maintaining religious identity while not allowing that identity to fundamentally transform how she treats people or makes decisions. The episode The Thin White Line from season 3 deals with Brian's cocaine addiction, and Lois's response reveals cognitive dissonance about substance use and addiction. She is critical of Brian's drug use and wants to help him recover, positioning herself as someone who understands that substance abuse is destructive and wrong. Yet, Lois herself uses alcohol to cope with stress, and she has engaged in addictive behaviors like shoplifting and gambling. A psychologist would note that criticizing addiction in others while engaging in addictive behaviors yourself creates cognitive dissonance that requires either acknowledging your own problems or finding ways to distinguish your behavior as different and less serious. Lois's cognitive dissonance about money and financial responsibility appears repeatedly throughout the series. She presents herself as financially responsible and criticizes Peter for wasteful spending and risky financial decisions. Yet she also makes purchases the family cannot afford. She prioritizes maintaining certain standards of living over financial prudence, and she sometimes values appearances over practical financial management. The episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1 shows Lois wanting to maintain holiday traditions even when the family's financial situation is uncertain, revealing that her own relationship with money is more emotionally driven than her criticism of Peter would suggest. A psychologist would recognize that the cognitive dissonance Lois experiences affects her mental health and emotional well-being. Living with constant awareness that you are not who you claim to be creates psychological strain. It requires mental energy to maintain rationalizations, to avoid examining contradictions too closely, to present yourself to the world in ways that hide your actual behavior and feelings. This energy expenditure leaves less capacity available for other psychological needs, including emotional regulation, impulse control, and genuine self-reflection. The contradiction between Lois's stated values about family and her actual family dynamics extends beyond her treatment of Meg. She claims to value family time and togetherness, yet she often seems relieved when family members are absent or occupied elsewhere. She says she wants the children to succeed and be happy, yet she does not provide consistent support for their goals and interests. She presents the family as her top priority, yet she pursues activities that take her away from family responsibilities. Each of these contradictions creates cognitive dissonance that Lois must manage through denial, rationalization, or simply not thinking too carefully about the gaps between her words and her actions. The episode Model Misbehavior from Season 3 shows Lois returning to modeling and becoming absorbed in that world to a degree that neglects her family responsibilities. A psychologist would note the cognitive dissonance between her stated commitment to family and her actual behavior when given opportunities to pursue personal interests. The modeling opportunity reveals that Lois's family commitment, while genuine in some respects, is also tinged with resentment, and that she would prefer, at least sometimes, to pursue her own interests rather than prioritizing family needs. Lois's cognitive dissonance about her marriage to Peter is perhaps the most fundamental and most difficult to resolve. She presents the marriage as a positive choice that she continues to affirm, defending Peter to her parents and to others who question her decision. Yet her actual experience of the marriage involves constant frustration, disappointment, and stress. A psychologist would recognize that acknowledging regret about marrying Peter would require facing devastating implications, including that she wasted years of her life, that her children are growing up in a dysfunctional situation she chose, and that she has sacrificed opportunities and possibilities for a relationship that does not make her happy. The cognitive dissonance is easier to bear than facing these realizations directly. The episode Meet the Quagmires from Season 5 includes flashbacks to when Lois and Peter first got together, showing the early relationship and reminding viewers of why Lois originally chose Peter. A psychologist would observe that returning to memories of the relationship's beginning can help reduce cognitive dissonance about staying in it now. By remembering why the choice initially made sense, Lois can maintain the belief that marrying Peter was right, even if the current reality is disappointing. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The cognitive dissonance between Lois's values and actions directly shapes her emotional resilience and vulnerability, determining how she copes with ongoing stress and whether she can maintain psychological stability despite the contradictions she lives with daily. Section 11. Emotional Resilience and Vulnerability. A psychologist observing Lois Griffin across the entire series would be struck by a paradox at the heart of her psychology. On one hand, Lois demonstrates remarkable resilience, continuing to function and manage her family despite extraordinary stress, repeated disappointments, and constant chaos. On the other hand, she shows significant vulnerabilities that suggest her resilience has limits, and that her coping mechanisms, while effective in the short term, may be unsustainable over time. Understanding the interplay between resilience and vulnerability in Lois's character reveals how people survive difficult circumstances while also accumulating psychological damage that affects their long-term well-being. Resilience refers to the ability to withstand stress, to recover from setbacks, and to continue functioning despite difficult circumstances. Lois demonstrates this resilience constantly throughout the series. Peter creates crisis after crisis, yet Lois continues managing the household, caring for the children, and maintaining some semblance of family functioning. The children present ongoing challenges with their various problems and needs, yet Lois keeps showing up as their mother. Financial pressures, social embarrassments, and personal disappointments occur regularly, yet Lois does not give up or abandon her responsibilities. This persistence in the face of adversity is the essence of resilience. The episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1 establishes this resilience pattern early. Peter loses his job and gambles away the family's money, creating a financial crisis that threatens their security. Lois discovers what happened and must cope with both the practical problems and the emotional betrayal. A psychologist would observe how Lois responds to this crisis. She is angry and disappointed, yet she does not collapse or become unable to function. Instead, she focuses on finding solutions, on managing the immediate problems, and on moving forward despite the setback. This ability to continue functioning during crisis demonstrates resilience. However, a psychologist would also note what Lois's resilience costs her. Each crisis she survives leaves some psychological residue, some small accumulation of stress and damage that does not fully resolve. Over time, these accumulations build up, creating vulnerabilities that make future crises harder to handle. The resilience that allows Lois to keep functioning also prevents her from fully addressing the underlying problems in her life, because she never reaches a breaking point that would force real change. The episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do from Season 4 reveals vulnerabilities beneath Lois's resilient exterior. The shoplifting behavior and subsequent breakdown in prison show that Lois's coping mechanisms are not as effective as they appear from outside. A psychologist would interpret the shoplifting as indicating that stress has overwhelmed her normal resilience, forcing her to seek relief through destructive behaviors. The breakdown reveals emotional pain that she has been suppressing while maintaining her resilient functioning. This demonstrates that resilience and vulnerability coexist, with the resilient facade sometimes hiding serious psychological distress. Lois's vulnerability to feelings of being trapped and overwhelmed appears in multiple episodes. The prison breakdown makes these feelings explicit, yet hints of them appear throughout the series in moments when Lois seems exhausted, defeated, or at the end of her capacity to cope. The episode Mind Over Murder from Season 1 shows Lois managing Peter's television obsession while handling all household responsibilities alone. During this episode, viewers can see her exhaustion and frustration, revealing the vulnerability that exists alongside her resilience. A psychologist would observe that Lois's resilience depends partly on her ability to compartmentalize emotions and suppress feelings that would interfere with functioning. This compartmentalization works as a short-term strategy, allowing her to handle immediate demands without being overwhelmed by emotions. However, the suppressed emotions do not disappear. They accumulate, creating internal pressure that eventually must find release. The shoplifting, the gambling, the occasional emotional explosions all represent moments when suppressed feelings break through the resilient exterior. The episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart from Season 3 shows Lois and Peter temporarily separating, forcing Lois to confront whether she wants to continue in the marriage. A psychologist would note that this separation represents a moment of vulnerability where Lois's usual resilience is insufficient to simply push through another crisis. She must actually stop and consider whether she can continue living this way. The fact that she ultimately reconciles with Peter suggests either that her resilience allows her to recommit to the marriage, or that her vulnerability makes her afraid to leave it. Possibly both factors contribute to her decision. Insecurity is a specific vulnerability that appears in Lois's character, despite her generally confident presentation. Episodes reveal that Lois worries about aging, about whether she is still attractive, about whether Peter might leave her for someone else. The episode Lois Comes Out of Her Shell from Season 11 shows Lois experiencing a midlife crisis driven partly by insecurity about her age and desirability. A psychologist would recognize that insecurity can undermine resilience by creating doubt about your ability to handle challenges and by making you more dependent on external validation. Jealousy represents another vulnerability in Lois's psychology. Episodes show her becoming jealous when Peter pays attention to other women, or when his interests take him away from the family. This jealousy suggests insecurity about her value to Peter, and fear that she might lose him despite all the problems in their relationship. A psychologist would observe that jealousy in long-term relationships often reflects deeper fears about abandonment, about not being good enough, or about having sacrificed for something that might disappear. The episode The Story on Page 1 from Season 2 includes moments where Lois seems jealous of Peter's attention to his journalism project. While her feelings might be justified given how Peter's obsessions typically neglect family needs, the intensity of her response suggests vulnerability around feeling secondary to Peter's interests. A psychologist would note that when someone fears they are not a priority for their partner, they become more vulnerable to feeling threatened by anything that takes the partner's attention away. Emotional detachment from her children, particularly from Meg, represents another vulnerability in Lois's psychology. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10 forces Lois to confront her failure to provide adequate emotional support and love to Meg. A psychologist would interpret this detachment as a defense mechanism, a way of protecting herself from the overwhelming demands of fully meeting all her children's emotional needs. However, this detachment is also a vulnerability because it damages her relationships with her children and because it prevents her from experiencing the satisfaction and connection that healthy parent-child relationships provide. The resilience Lois shows in practical matters contrasts with vulnerability in emotional matters. She can manage household tasks, solve logistical problems, and handle practical crises effectively. However, when it comes to emotional challenges like processing feelings, maintaining intimate connections, or addressing underlying relationship problems, Lois shows less resilience and more vulnerability. The episode Lethal Weapons from Season 3 demonstrates this pattern. Lois can learn martial arts and master physical skills, yet she struggles to manage the emotional complexity of Peter's jealousy about her new abilities. A psychologist would observe that resilience in some areas can mask vulnerability in others. Lois's competence at practical management makes her appear stronger overall than she actually is emotionally. People around her, including family members, might assume she is fine because she continues functioning and handling responsibilities. This assumption prevents her from receiving support she needs and creates pressure to maintain the resilient appearance even when doing so becomes increasingly difficult. The episode Road to Rupert from Season 5 shows Lois managing a difficult situation with Stewie while also handling other family demands. Her ability to juggle multiple responsibilities simultaneously demonstrates resilience. However, a psychologist would also notice signs of strain, moments when Lois seems to be barely holding things together rather than managing comfortably. This suggests that her resilience is being tested near its limits, creating vulnerability to breakdown if circumstances become slightly more difficult. Physical health can both support and be affected by psychological resilience and vulnerability. Episodes occasionally show Lois appearing physically exhausted or stressed, suggesting that the psychological demands of her life are taking a physical toll. A psychologist would recognize that chronic stress affects physical health through multiple pathways, including immune function, cardiovascular health, and overall energy levels. If Lois's physical health deteriorates due to chronic stress, her psychological resilience will likely decrease as well, creating a downward spiral where vulnerability increases over time. The episode The Thin White Line from Season 3 deals with Brian's addiction, and Lois's role in managing this crisis demonstrates both resilience and vulnerability. She can organize an intervention, she can provide support, she can handle the practical aspects of helping Brian recover. Yet the emotional toll of this crisis, combined with all the other stressors in her life, likely increases her vulnerability even as she demonstrates resilience in managing the situation. A psychologist would observe that resilience in handling crises does not mean those crises have no cost. Each one depletes resources and makes future challenges harder to handle. Social support could help buffer stress and support resilience. Yet, as discussed in previous sections, Lois lacks strong social support networks. She does not have close friends with whom she can share her struggles. Her relationship with her parents is complicated and not particularly supportive. Her marriage provides limited emotional support given Peter's emotional unavailability. This lack of social support increases Lois's vulnerability because she must rely entirely on her own internal resources to cope with stress. A psychologist would recognize that people with strong social support are more resilient than people who face challenges alone. The episode Eat Peterbus Unum from Season 2 shows Lois managing household functioning when Peter declares the house an independent nation. Her resilience allows the family to continue meeting basic needs despite Peter's ridiculous project. However, a psychologist would also observe the accumulated frustration and exhaustion that comes from constantly adapting to Peter's chaos while receiving no appreciation or recognition for her efforts. This lack of recognition for her resilience creates vulnerability by undermining her sense that her efforts matter and are valued. Hope and optimism can support resilience by providing belief that circumstances will improve. Early in the series, Lois seems to maintain some hope that Peter will mature, that the children will become more manageable, that family life will become easier. However, as the series continues and these hopes remain unfulfilled, a psychologist might observe decreased optimism in Lois's character. This loss of hope represents a growing vulnerability because without belief that things will improve, continuing to cope with difficult circumstances becomes psychologically harder. The episode Meet the Quagmires from Season 5 includes flashbacks that show young Lois before years of accumulated stress and disappointment. The contrast between young Lois and current Lois reveals how much resilience has cost her. She has survived, she has continued functioning, yet she has also lost something of the vitality and possibility that characterized her younger self. A psychologist would recognize this as demonstrating that resilience is not cost-free. You can survive difficult circumstances and still be damaged by them. Lois's vulnerabilities also include her limited options for escape or change. She depends financially on Peter's income. She has children who need care. She lacks recent work experience that would allow her to support herself independently. These practical constraints create psychological vulnerability because they limit her choices about how to respond to dissatisfaction. A psychologist would observe that feeling trapped with limited options reduces resilience by making problems feel unsolvable. The episode Model Misbehavior from Season 3 shows Lois attempting to reclaim her modeling career, which could provide income and independence. However, this attempt is temporary and ultimately unsuccessful in creating lasting change in her circumstances. A psychologist would interpret this as revealing both Lois's desire for greater autonomy and her realistic assessment that escaping her current situation is extremely difficult. This awareness of being trapped increases vulnerability by creating hopelessness about the possibility of meaningful change. The resilience Lois demonstrates in bouncing back from crises also prevents her from hitting bottom in ways that might force real change. Each time she manages to cope with another crisis, she proves to herself and others that she can continue functioning in her current circumstances. This prevents the kind of breakdown that might lead to seeking professional help, demanding real changes in the marriage, or making difficult decisions about whether to continue living this way. A psychologist would recognize this as a paradox, where resilience that allows survival also prevents growth or transformation. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of resilience masking deeper vulnerability and the psychological costs of merely surviving rather than thriving bring us to consider what Lois Griffin's character ultimately reveals about human psychology, family dynamics, and the complex realities of navigating life's contradictions. Section 12. What Lois Griffin's patterns teach us. A psychologist, reflecting on everything we have observed about Lois Griffin, would recognize that her character offers valuable insights into human psychology, particularly regarding how people navigate conflicting demands, manage chronic stress, and maintain identity while fulfilling roles that feel limiting or overwhelming. While Lois is a fictional character in an animated comedy, the psychological patterns she demonstrates are recognizable and real, reflecting struggles that many people face in their own lives. Understanding what Lois's patterns teach us can help illuminate broader questions about responsibility, identity, relationships, and resilience. One of the most important lessons from observing Lois is that people are far more complex than the roles they occupy. Lois functions primarily as wife and mother, and these roles dominate her daily life. However, beneath these roles exists a person with her own needs, desires, contradictions, and struggles. She is not simply a wife and mother. She is a person who happens to occupy those roles while also being many other things, including someone with unfulfilled ambitions, suppressed desires, moral contradictions, and unresolved conflicts. A psychologist would emphasize that seeing people only through their roles, rather than as complete individuals, leads to misunderstanding their psychology and their behavior. The episode Model Misbehavior from Season 3 demonstrates this complexity by showing aspects of Lois's personality that emerge when she temporarily steps outside her primary family roles. The competitive drive, the concern with appearance, the desire for recognition from people beyond her family. These aspects exist within her constantly, yet only find expression when circumstances permit. This teaches us that the person we see in any given role represents only part of who that person actually is. The gap between the person Lois presents herself as being and the person she actually is teaches important lessons about authenticity and self-knowledge. Lois wants to be responsible, moral, selfless, and devoted. She presents herself this way to others and probably wants to believe this about herself. However, her actual behavior reveals someone more complicated, someone who acts impulsively, who has questionable moral boundaries, who seeks excitement and escape, and who sometimes prioritizes her own needs over family obligation. This gap between ideal self and actual self is not unique to Lois. Most people experience some version of this gap. The question is whether you can acknowledge the gap honestly, or whether you must maintain defenses and rationalizations to avoid facing it. A psychologist would observe that Lois's psychological struggles stem largely from trying to maintain an identity and fulfill roles that do not align with her authentic needs and desires. She chose to marry Peter and have children, yet this choice has led to a life that often feels limiting and unsatisfying. She values her family, yet she also resents the demands they place on her. She wants to be a good mother, yet she struggles to provide consistent emotional support. These contradictions create ongoing psychological distress because Lois cannot fully embrace either her responsibilities or her desire to escape them. The pattern of responsibility without control that characterizes Lois's life teaches lessons about how caregiving roles affect psychology. When someone is responsible for others' well-being, yet cannot control the factors that determine outcomes, they experience a particular type of stress that differs from responsibility with authority. Lois is responsible for her family functioning well, yet Peter constantly undermines her efforts. The children make their own choices regardless of her guidance, and circumstances often work against her plans. This creates chronic stress that accumulates over time and that can lead to the kinds of breakdowns and maladaptive coping we have observed in her character. The episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1 establishes this pattern in the very first episode, showing that from the beginning, Lois has been managing consequences of problems she did not create and cannot fully control. This pattern continuing across hundreds of episodes reveals something important about the sustainability of such arrangements. People can function under these conditions for extended periods, yet the psychological cost accumulates and eventually manifests through various symptoms including anxiety, depression, impulse control problems, and relationship difficulties. A psychologist would note that caregiving without adequate support or recognition creates psychological vulnerability. Lois receives little appreciation for her efforts, little help with her responsibilities, and little emotional support when she struggles. The work she does is largely invisible because it involves maintaining normal functioning rather than accomplishing dramatic achievements. This lack of recognition affects self-esteem and motivation, making it harder to continue providing care while receiving so little in return. The lesson here is that caregivers need support, recognition, and opportunities for their own fulfillment, not just expectations that they will sacrifice endlessly without complaint. The cognitive dissonance Lois experiences between her values and her actions teaches lessons about how people manage contradictions. Rather than facing the contradictions directly and either changing behavior or honestly revising values, Lois uses rationalization, minimization, and compartmentalization to avoid confronting the gaps in her self-understanding. This allows her to maintain her self-image while continuing behaviors that contradict it, yet it also prevents genuine self-knowledge and authentic living. A psychologist would observe that many people use similar strategies to manage cognitive dissonance, protecting their self-image at the cost of self-awareness. The episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do from Season 4 forces some of this cognitive dissonance into awareness when Lois gets arrested and must face the contradiction between her law-abiding self-image and her actual criminal behavior. However, even this confrontation does not lead to deep examination of why the contradiction existed. Instead, the incident is resolved and life returns to normal, with the underlying issues remaining unaddressed. This teaches us that simply becoming aware of contradictions is not sufficient for change. Real change requires willingness to examine contradictions honestly and to make difficult choices about either behavior or values. Lois's struggles with identity outside her family roles teach lessons about the importance of maintaining individual identity even within committed relationships and family structures. When Lois's entire identity becomes absorbed by her roles as wife and mother, she loses connection with parts of herself that need different forms of expression and fulfillment. The attempts she makes to reclaim modeling, to run for school board, or to pursue other interests represent legitimate needs for identity that extends beyond family service. The fact that these attempts typically fail or are unsustainable reveals how difficult it is to maintain individual identity while meeting intensive family demands. A psychologist would emphasize that maintaining individual identity within family structures requires intentional effort and usually requires support from family members who respect and facilitate the person's need for autonomous activities and self-development. Lois does not receive this support from Peter, who expects her to be constantly available for family needs. The lesson here is that healthy families allow and encourage individual growth for all members, rather than expecting some members, typically mothers, to sacrifice their individual identity completely. The episode Lois Comes Out of Her Shell from season 11 shows what happens when identity suppression reaches a critical point and the person attempts to reclaim lost aspects of themselves through dramatic means. The midlife crisis Lois experiences represents an eruption of suppressed identity needs that can no longer be contained. This teaches us that identity needs do not disappear through suppression. They persist and eventually demand expression, sometimes in ways that create problems for the person and their relationships. The marital dynamics between Lois and Peter teach lessons about relationships characterized by imbalance in contribution and support. Peter creates problems that Lois must solve. Peter pursues his interests while Lois manages household responsibilities. Peter receives emotional support from Lois while providing little in return. This imbalance creates resentment and exhaustion over time. Yet the relationship continues because Lois keeps adapting to Peter's limitations rather than demanding real change. A psychologist would observe that relationships with this kind of fundamental imbalance rarely become more equitable without intervention, and that the accommodating partner typically pays significant psychological costs. The lesson about relationships is that love and commitment are not sufficient to sustain healthy partnerships. Relationships also require reciprocity, mutual support, respect for each partner's needs, and willingness to make real changes when patterns become destructive. Lois's continued commitment to Peter, despite ongoing problems, demonstrates loyalty. Yet it also raises questions about when loyalty becomes self-destructive. The episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart from season 3 explores this question when the couple temporarily separates, forcing both to consider whether the marriage is worth maintaining despite its problems. Lois's parenting patterns teach lessons about how stress affects caregiving quality. When psychological resources are depleted by chronic stress, parenting becomes less consistent, less patient, and less emotionally available. The differential treatment Lois shows her children, particularly her neglect of Meg, reflects the reality that she has limited emotional capacity and allocates it unevenly when overwhelmed. A psychologist would observe that recognizing parental limitations is important for understanding family dynamics and for providing appropriate support to struggling parents. The lesson here is not that Lois is simply a bad mother, but rather that parenting quality depends on the parent having adequate resources, including emotional support, practical help, time for self-care, and reasonable expectations. When these resources are absent, even capable parents struggle to meet their children's needs consistently. This suggests that supporting parents requires addressing not just parenting skills, but the broader context that affects parents' capacity to function effectively. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10 reveals the consequences of inadequate parenting when Meg confronts the family, showing that children are damaged when parents cannot provide consistent emotional support. The impulse control issues Lois demonstrates teach lessons about how suppressed needs seek expression. When legitimate needs for excitement, autonomy, recognition, or escape are denied or suppressed, they do not disappear. Instead, they find expression through behaviors that might be destructive or maladaptive. The shoplifting represents Lois's need for excitement and control, finding expression in a harmful way, because she does not give herself permission to meet these needs through legitimate channels. A psychologist would emphasize that acknowledging needs and finding healthy ways to meet them is preferable to rigid suppression that eventually leads to problematic behaviors. The resilience and vulnerability patterns in Lois's character teach lessons about the limits of individual coping. Lois demonstrates that people can survive extraordinary stress and continue functioning through sheer determination and effective coping strategies. However, the fact that she also shows significant vulnerabilities and occasional breakdowns reveals that resilience has limits. You can cope with difficult circumstances for a long time, yet the stress still takes a toll. The accumulated damage from chronic stress affects mental health, physical health, and overall quality of life, even when the person continues meeting their responsibilities. A psychologist would observe that celebrating resilience without acknowledging its costs can be harmful because it creates pressure to keep coping indefinitely, rather than addressing the underlying problems creating stress. Sometimes the most psychologically healthy response is not resilience, but rather recognition that circumstances need to change because continuing to cope with them is unsustainable. The social behavior patterns Lois demonstrates teach lessons about the psychological burden of maintaining appearances while struggling privately. Lois works hard to present herself and her family as normal and acceptable to the community, while knowing the reality is quite different. This gap between public presentation and private experience requires constant vigilance and creates anxiety about being discovered. A psychologist would observe that many people experience similar pressures to appear fine while struggling, and that this pressure to maintain false fronts prevents seeking help and creates isolation. The lesson here is that authenticity, while risky, is psychologically healthier than maintaining elaborate pretenses about how you are doing. Being honest about struggles allows connection with others who might provide support, reduces the energy spent on impression management, and permits more genuine self-awareness. However, authenticity also requires having safe relationships and communities where vulnerability will be met with support rather than judgment. Lois Griffin's character ultimately teaches us that psychology is complex, that people contain contradictions, and that understanding someone requires looking beneath surface presentations to see the struggles and needs that drive behavior. She teaches us about the costs of caregiving, the importance of individual identity, the challenges of managing cognitive dissonance, and the limits of resilience. She teaches us that comedy can reveal serious truths about human psychology, and that even fictional characters can illuminate real psychological patterns that affect countless people in their actual lives. A psychologist observing Lois would recognize her as representing common human experiences, including feeling trapped by responsibilities, struggling with identity questions, managing relationships that are both meaningful and frustrating, and trying to balance self-care with obligations to others. While the specific details of Lois's life are unique to the animated world of Family Guy, the underlying psychological patterns are universal. By examining these patterns carefully and compassionately, we can learn not just about Lois Griffin, but about ourselves and about how human beings navigate the complex challenges of modern life. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.